Good morning again from Biddeford. Welcome to all of you who are here in person, as well as those of you up at our Bangor satellite location and those of you who are zooming in with us this morning. It's 9 o'clock or 9:01. We're going to get things started. I'm going to invite my board chair up to get things rolling. So take your seats, grab your coffee, and we're going to be good to go. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I know we've still got some people working their way in and getting name tags and coffee and all of that, but we're right about at 9, so we're going to get things started, and we'll give folks just a couple more minutes, and then we'll get rolling. I'm sure people are going to continue to kind of filter in, but as you all probably read, we also have a location in Bangor today. So can we say hello to the Bangor folks? Do we have them on video, on screen?
Hello, Bangor!
I know. Hello, Bangor. I thought we might see them on the screen, but I think there we are. Good morning, the Bangor contingent. Thank you, and that is hosted. Thank you to Robin Stanicki for hosting there. They're at Eastern Maine Community College. And welcome to all of you here in Biddeford, and for those folks that are joining us virtually. I know we do have some folks who are online also today. So we really appreciate you all being here. Before we dive into our program, we just wanted to give a thank you to our lead sponsors who have been very generous in supporting the summit today and the organization. So we have Port Property and CMP, Kennebec Savings Bank, the Nature Conservancy, and the Betterment Fund have all been lead sponsors. And we do have a few words from Port Property and CMP.
Jay Chase. I'm working as part of the community relations team in doing outreach to municipalities and economic development leaders in the region to work collaboratively as they are in their planning or concept stages of new projects to think about what their electrical needs might be. And we feel this is important work so that we can really find efficiencies in the process on the development side of things so that we can potentially save costs and timing for projects, and really having the electric service at the table early really can help to make that a more efficient and effective process. I spent 20 years as a municipal planner here in southern Maine, and I've really enjoyed sort of applying the skills that I picked up in that role here at CMP.
Thank you. And next, I just wanted to note that GrowSmart we're progressing in our journey to greater equity, diversity, and inclusion. And part of that is a dedication to building authentic relationships with more diverse stakeholders. In recent years, we've opened this event with a land acknowledgement. Today, however, we are honored to have the Penobscot Nation Tribal Ambassador, Maulian joining us to share her words.
Great to see you all. There I am. So I'm really honored to share with you all today. And I don't typically tend to do land acknowledgements because I do feel that that is the work of others. So I would say welcome to Wabanaki homeland. And in our language, we say Agwane, welcome. And I'm truly happy to be able to share with you today because, as you mentioned, the land acknowledgement really should be a jumping off place of a larger, more collaborative relationship. And I do feel that GrowSmart and so many folks that I'm seeing on the Zoom here today have walked their talk about having relationships with the Wabanaki people in our homelands now called Maine. So when I thought about how to best welcome you all here today, I looked over your program and some of your mission statements, and I really do love the feeling that advocacy is empowering. That has certainly been true in my life, and I think a lot of Indigenous leaders and Wabanaki people, and a lot of the more marginalized, vulnerable people in our state feel that way, that when we are able to speak truth to power and clearly communicate the needs of our people, that's empowering. But what takes that further and makes progress really happen in some instances is having the networks and the alliances and the relationships. So I'm really happy to continue to deepen those bonds here today. And I like the mission of your conference, and I love the idea that we will not move our state forward if we don't bring everyone along. So when we think about the next generations, when we think about equity measures today, I think it's very critical to think about the self-determination and the sovereignty of the tribal populations in Maine. And that would be the Wabanaki Confederacy, the Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Mi'kmaq, and Maliseet, and there are Abenaki people who have been displaced but live here in their homelands. So together, we have worked on a lot of legislative initiatives the past few sessions, and we ended up forming the Wabanaki Alliance, which I know a lot of you are familiar with. So I would suggest that a great way to deepen the relationship further, if you're interested, is to check out WabanakiAlliance.com, look into the history of the tribes in the state and how being an ally and a friend to the tribes really helps advance the interests of everyone in Maine. And I know that a lot of you have seen that for yourself and have really benefited from joining our coalition and learning more about the tribes. So again, welcome. I would urge you to keep the tribes in mind as you go about your great work today and throughout your journeys and everywhere you go. And Chiwalimani, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Dana. So I am Becca Casey. I'm the board chair for GrowSmart Maine, and I've just got a few words for everyone before we get into the exciting parts of the agenda today. So a few thoughts from my perspective and the work that I do. The old adage that people know what they like when they see it is as accurately attributed to places as it is to artwork. And many of you with us today also have the experience and expertise to understand the importance of the environments that we surround ourselves with and their fundamental roles in the health and well-being of people and the planet. So that really essentially means you know why you like what you see, which is not something that everyone has. But how we get to solutions that people will overwhelmingly like, that's in the process of how we get to those solutions. So I'm an architect by day, I call it. I put on my GrowSmart hat, which means essentially that I'm trained in creative problem solving applied to the built environment. This is oftentimes now referred to as design thinking. Design thinking starts with acknowledging the context. In Maine, that's rolling farmland and country roads or historic mixed-use downtowns, that physical context. And then convening stakeholders. And stakeholders are really anyone that's affected by your project. So that's, owners, the users, people that are going to be observing it. And then also displaced entities, even nature and the environment can be your stakeholders. So then from that, you set goals to build on the strengths and identify the challenges, and especially when we're looking at solutions across the state, those strengths and challenges can be sides of the same coin. And then the hard work of designing that, those solutions, which is really the pushing and pulling of ideas and optimizing that balance between sustainability, human needs and well-being, and future flexibility. I encourage you to apply this process to the work that we'll be doing on Policy Action 2023, and to circle back to the context and the stakeholders and the goals as you progress through. And one thing I especially ask is to remember to revisit the stakeholders with every decision and every milestone that you make. Always remember that there are more stakeholders that are not in the room. Who are they or what are they? Are you able to invite them to the conversation? And if so, bring them in, and if not, try to put yourself in their shoes, understanding that sometimes participation and insights may be disappointing and it seems like you don't get a lot from that, but sometimes also the smallest consideration makes the difference for a successful result. So I thank all of you in advance for your engagement and dedication and for bringing diverse voices to build broad-based support and to chart the path forward for a thriving and resilient Maine. The agenda you have up here, you've probably got it electronically, it's printed out in your program, so you have plenty of that. But we are thrilled to bring to you two keynotes from across the smart growth spectrum of interconnected concerns. I note quickly, because this was poetic, that on our initial Zoom meeting, John Piotti, who has such an effect on rural and farmland, was calling in from DC and had a cityscape behind him, and Mike, who is speaking to what we often think of as more urban, walkability and bikeability concerns, was calling in from a porch on a cabin in the woods. And so I thought it was a very poetic juxtaposition of reminding us that we're all affected and interacting with both of those kinds of environments, and we need to remember the interconnection of those. So we'll hear from both of them and then dive deeper into the conversation. Our moderator today is Rhiannon Hampson. She is the USDA Rural Development Director for the state of Maine, a community advocate, a farmer, and a blast of positive energy that, as the State Rural Development Council, GrowSmart Maine has had the great pleasure of welcoming to our board of directors as an ex officio member this year. Following that discussion, as you see the rest, we will break out for the Policy Action 2023 work groups, and then you'll find lunch will be out in the lobby. Enjoy the food, and then we want to be back here at 12:45 for the Smart Growth Awards, followed by our annual meeting. And then we will head out into the community for tours and conversations. And our return of the reception this afternoon will be at the local brewery here as well as in Bangor with some special congressional guests. So with that, I will hand it over to Rhiannon. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's so excited. It's wonderful to be here. It's nice to see everyone here. Welcome to everyone joining us virtually. Sometimes I think my speediness gets mistaken for positivity, but I'll take it. I'm going to try not to talk too fast. I feel like the time is now. We have a lot of work to do, and I feel like things are very urgent. Every report that comes out, every news article we read, every time I listen to NPR in the car, I feel like now, right? As I face every birthday, I feel like I've got to get more done. And so that's why I'm thrilled to serve the Biden-Harris administration as the state director for USDA Rural Development. We are a little bit of the Gen X agency, so I feel like it's very fitting that I take on this role at this time. We're kind of ubiquitous, right? Everyone, if you drove more than 10 miles to get here, I guarantee you went by millions and millions of dollars that USDA Rural Development has invested in your space, in the spaces that you were driving by. But nobody really knows. We're a little bit of a best-kept secret. Maybe sometimes we like it that way. Helps us not to be too controversial. But one of my kind of like urgent jobs, I think, during this time is I'm trying to make rural development sexy. And that's a little hard to do sometimes, right? Because we're also your fantastic water and wastewater partner. And so touring wastewater facilities and trying to make them pretty cool can be a little hard sometimes, but we're doing it. And why? Because our water and wastewater facilities are directly tied to our climate goals. Because every time we are polluting through aging infrastructure in those spaces, we're closing clam flats, we're shutting down fisheries, and we're devastating the spaces that we live here for. Anyone that travels through any of our back roads in a winter in Maine knows that we live here in spite of that and not because of it. And so what we can do as individuals participating in these spaces, I think is critically important. So when we step in and we help build a clean and good and safe wastewater facility, every single one of the ratepayers it's now a part of the climate solution. They don't need to be someone with a great deal of privilege or a great deal of means or a great deal of education in engineering or climate spaces. By being a ratepayer of that utility, they are now part of the climate solution when we step in and help partner with them to do that. So that inclusivity that everybody's talking about, finding spaces where people can plug in, that's what we're doing here, and that's what we're doing at Rural Development. I'm going to try not to bore you with anything bureaucratic. We are a bureaucracy, and we are a federal agency. We do really exciting projects. I don't have a slideshow of the ecology school on here, but I would encourage any of you to visit because that's where we look really good when we're funding that kind of thing. But I'm going to talk about, we have 3 main buckets that we work with in rural development. And those 3 buckets are our housing programs. This is sort of a real bread and butter kind of program. We make more single-family home loans to low-income people than any other entity in the state. I'm really proud of that. We also have the oldest housing stock in the country. And so we have a home repair loan fund as well to help make sure that those people are getting into safe and affordable housing. That's not always easy, so we're happy to partner with all kinds of entities. And I should say we've been working a lot with GrowSmart Maine this year around housing. Nancy's advocacy on housing was fantastic. We're really appreciative of that, and GrowSmart is our Rural Development Council partner here in the state of Maine. Not every state is fortunate enough to have one. Many of the state sort of partner agencies were orphaned a couple of farm bills ago, and so they shut down. GrowSmart Maine stepped in and took up that mantle in, I believe, 2019 to do this work out of the goodness of their hearts. We're working on some ways to make sure that that can be funded, but it is a formal arrangement and it's critical, and it sort of ties into what we're all doing here today, right? That idea of networking and partnering to get people in safe houses. So we do housing preservation. We also do self-help building programs. So we partner with CCI over in western Maine counties. They're expanding into more counties. And people can build. They don't just have to exist in really old housing stock. I start my day in a house from 1781, and it's falling down. It's only ever been owned by poor people, and it still is. We farm. We farm. So the dairy barn is a lot nicer than my house from 1781. But I understand that I inhabit the privilege that I can move through my day despite that. Not everyone can. So we're building new houses through our self-help building program. Tammy? We also have, what else do we have? Next slide, please. We have community programs. So this is pretty fantastic. We buy ambulances with power lifts. I can actually put a 400-pound person in the back of an ambulance with a power lift that we purchase. For these folks, it's kind of exciting. That's a workforce development issue. If everyone's out there injuring themselves, it's a lot harder to ask them to be on the front lines in January at 1 o'clock in the morning, saving someone that we probably care deeply about. So we're going in and we're helping with our healthcare infrastructure through those procurements. We made several emergency rural healthcare grants. We announced a couple of those just yesterday. We thank Senator King and Congresswoman Pingree for their support of the funding where that came from, and we are happy to spend all of that here in the state of Maine. I want to give a huge shout out to my community facilities team because they spent all of the emergency rural healthcare grant that Maine was given, and then they've gone back to the national office to spend other people's money as well. And that's what I like. So I grew up in very rural spaces, and we desperately need, more investment. And so my team is pretty crackerjack, and they know that our number one goal is to not leave any money on the table. We're not sending any of it back. It's a use it or lose it situation in our budget. So we do wastewater treatment facilities. That's fine. It's fine. We do all kinds of things. We build community facilities. We build outdoor education spaces. We build fire stations and libraries, food hubs, soup kitchens, food pantries, daycare centers. Rural development does a lot. I think we have over 100 programs in our community facilities. So we also have our business and cooperative service. So our rural business and cooperative service puts solar panels on barn roofs. We go in and we do value-added producer grants. I'm going to say my one farm has never had a value-added producer grant. So there's no ethical conflict here. But my one farm benefits from 3 other farms that did receive value-added producer grants. So we step in and we help with that food systems transformation and building, because every time we're trying to be very good stewards of public tax dollars, and every time we invest those public tax dollars somewhere, we want to make sure that there's a return to everyone from that. I'm going to give a shout out to Russell Libby, who I think I was 15 years old when I learned about the multiplier effect, that when we spend $1 in our community, that dollar can turn into a couple of $2, $3. It depends on how we spend it and where we spend it. So every dollar that rural development is investing in the state of Maine stays and multiplies within our small communities. When we build libraries, we're helping children learn how to read. And so these are sort of critical infrastructure spaces that we know are a huge return on our investment, sometimes tangible and sometimes intangible. Those renewable energy programs that we talk about, we also help upgrade freezers and coolers. Talk about being part of the climate solution. If you have a barn store and you're running ancient walk-ins that require a lot of maintenance all of the time, you're probably not being the best climate steward when you step out onto your no-till agriculture farm and then try to engage in some carbon sequestration. But we are there to help. So we're trying our very best to live our values. And at USDA Rural Development, we feel like we're helping people inhabit that space. So that's my pitch. I wanted to keep it not boring. Is anyone bored with rural development? Don't raise your hand. Okay, good. Oh, and I want to highlight too, because I see John in the audience, Genesis is represented here, that we also do revolving loan fund investments. So we make grants to entities, we make very low interest loans to entities who then step in with that technical support. So we feel like a last mile connector. We're that warm handoff, that we make. Okay, this is super not boring. We spent over $379 million in the last fiscal year here in Maine. Our fiscal year runs on the federal fiscal year, which means it's Happy New Year to us. Right now, we're getting more money that we're excited to figure out how we want to spend this coming year. So that $379 million is broken down kind of in the way that you see on the chart here. That's not necessarily indicative always of the priority areas, right? We don't prioritize anything based on where we're putting that money. Our money comes through with guardrails on it from appropriations. It comes through with guardrails on it, in Farm Bill programming, which we're working on next year. So this is not a prioritization necessarily of the funds, but this is where we are excited to kind of double down with those investments. So that is our thrilling rural development moment. I hope that I have just made bureaucracy a little more accessible for everyone here, because that's it. We work in an alphabet soup of acronyms, and that right there is a barrier to accessibility. The reason that it's hard for people to participate sometimes in our government is because we speak in a different language. Every time new crops of people come in, they use new terms. So my term now is level setting. I'm using level setting. I think you're all using it too in your meetings. And I don't know if you remember, but maybe 2 years ago, we did not call it that. We said, we're going to manage expectations. So we change our language when we're in these spaces, and that in and of itself can be a barrier to people being able to advocate. So I'm excited to have this discussion with these two folks. And I think, Nancy, I'm looking for the high sign. Am I introducing? I'm introducing everyone now. So this is fantastic. I'm actually really excited. So John Piotti is here from American Farmland Trust. And John, I have all my notes because your bio is long, but you look fabulous. I'm aspiring. So John is currently serving as the president for American Farmland Trust since 2016. But John helped found Maine Farmland Trust. Shout out to our Maine Farmland Trust folks in the back. I love working with them. Pretty fantastic, to preserve Maine farmland and agricultural land. And again, one of the spaces that we talk about all the time is we're either at the end of the pipeline or we're at the beginning of the pipeline. And we cannot possibly feed ourselves, nor can we help the rest of New England, because you can't grow lettuce or cows in Boston if we don't have farmland protected. Farmland protection is neighborhood protection, right? We are trying to create spaces to recreate. So John helped found Maine Farmland Trust in 1999, served in our Maine legislature from 2002 to 2010, and is here today to talk a little bit about his work and about advocacy for us. So John, welcome up, and I'm going to introduce Mike right behind you. I guess we'll bring you guys both up at the same time, according to the run of show that I was saying. Right? Mm-hmm. There we go. Or we can do it separate. I'll step in. I'll step in a moment. All right, John, take it away.
Oh,
this is
okay,
your moment.
Do it this way.
We're winging it here. I told you bureaucracy isn't boring.
Is this the clicker? This is a special looking clicker. Let's see if it works. It works. Okay, great. Well, it's fantastic to be here. It's wonderful to be home. I came up from DC yesterday, and as the Concord Trailways bus crested over the bridge in Kittery, it just felt really good. I am of this place, the first member of the Piotti family to come to the United States, emigrated to Mid-Coast Maine in 1868 to work in the quarries on Vinyl Haven and then Hurricane Island. And my mother's family, French-Canadian, came down ultimately to work in the shoe factories of Lynn, Massachusetts, but over a period of a century or more down through western Maine. So this is my home. And I did not, however, spend my youth here, and I'm going to talk about that at the end. But I've spent my pretty much entire adult life And I've spent pretty much my entire adult life working on issues of farming and agriculture. That's involved work on farmland protection, as you just heard, a lot of business development work that I did when I ran the farms programming at CEI for 11 years, and my advocacy work both locally and in the legislature. So that's been my vocation, working with farmers. But my hobby has been planning. And I know that might sound odd, but it really has been. And when I moved to Unity in 1987, I believe, I got actively involved, and I lived in Unity for close to 35 years. And during that period of time, I spent maybe 20 plus years either chairing the Comprehensive Plan Committee or the Planning Board. And then I had the pleasure of being a founding board member of GrowSmart Maine. And this organization, under current leadership, is just doing some amazing work. So shout out to you, Nancy, and your team. So that's the context, and I know we're going to have a robust conversation later about advocacy, and advocacy will be a thread through some of the slides that I show you, but I need to give you some foundational information first, and then I think we'll pull out some of those pieces as we go on. I'm going to talk about a lot today, so I'm going to talk rather quickly because I have a lot to cover. I want to talk about agriculture itself because it is the most fascinating topic in the world. I also want to talk about one of the major challenges confronting us as a planet and agriculture, which is the loss of farmland, why that's important. I'm going to explain that a little bit, and then I'm going to tie it in with planning issues in some form. So a lot of people are not familiar with American Farmland Trust. They may know our iconic bumper sticker, and I didn't bring any with me. Actually, I think I have one in the bottom of my briefcase somewhere. But we love to give them out. So if you give me your business card and put a number on the back, I will send you as many bumper stickers as the number you put on the back of that card. But people know that, but they don't really know much about the organization. And that's understandable because we've really, in some ways, done a lot of work behind the scenes over the last 40 some odd years. Oops, I've skipped ahead. I want to give you a history of American agriculture, a very condensed history, and I think that's the best way to help understand American Farmland Trust's role in all of this. So let's begin in 1837. John Deere, yes, he was a real person. John Deere invented the first steel moldboard plow, and that changed everything. Before then, the turf in the prairie from Indiana stretching west was simply too thick to get the standard plows of the days through. This opened up literally tens of millions of acres to agriculture that had never been used in this manner. And as industrious humans, what did we do? We had this new technology innovation, so we plowed and we plowed and we plowed and we plowed. Jump ahead 90 years, you had the Great Dust Bowl. Excessive use of the plow was only one cause of the Dust Bowl. It's complicated, we spent an hour talking about that, but it was one of the causes. There was an incredibly progressive agriculture administration in place during the 1930s, led by Henry Wallace. Any of you, who's heard of Henry Wallace? Very few of you. Henry Wallace is the forgotten man in American history. He was this close to being president. The only reason he was not president was that the power bosses, he was FDR's VP in his third term, and the power bosses thought he was too liberal, so they put Truman forward, and FDR didn't really care, and it went on. But he was the Secretary of Agriculture for 2 terms. He was the Secretary of Commerce. He was our Vice President. And on the side, he founded Pioneer Seed Company. Absolutely amazing man, and one of the first to really recognize the importance of soil conservation. So we developed within USDA the Soil Conservation Service, now the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. And they began to do some really important work. But then World War II intervened, and we had bigger things to worry about, and a lot of that was put on hold. And then after the war, we had a couple of things going on. One was we had this new technological information that we didn't have. A lot of it was developed during the war years. And the second, we had a world that was on the verge of famine. And by some estimates, as many as 1 billion people could have starved worldwide in the period from the mid-40s through probably the early 50s, had it not been for the introduction of new rice varieties and other things, sometimes collectively termed the Green Revolution. It did a lot of good, it did a lot of bad. And I won't go into the details on that, but the summary is that the form of agriculture that we utilized during that period of time was environmentally harmful and completely unsustainable. And yet much of that kind of agriculture remains to this day. The next step in our journey is thinking about the rising environmental movement. Silent Spring came out in, 60, 61, First Earth Day, 70. During this period of time, we had the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the creation of the EPA. It was a time of burgeoning environmental awareness, not only in the public, but in the policy sector. Very important. But it had a strange effect on agriculture. Once some of the big point sources of pollution, like factories and wastewater treatment plants, were being addressed, the next target in the mind of many environmentalists were the non-point source pollutants. And who was on the top of that list? Farmers, right? So farmers and environmentalists in the 70s in particular were really at odds. Now you could argue that still exists to some extent, but believe me, not in the way that it did 45 years ago. They were truly at odds. And farmers believed that environmentalists were a bunch of tree huggers who wanted nothing more than to regulate them out of business. And environmentalists viewed farmers not as good stewards of the land, but as polluters. That was the reality 45 years ago. Now, at the same time, we also had post-war all of this sprawling development. And by the mid-70s, a few people were starting to take notice, and the President's Council on Environmental Quality and USDA teamed up to undertake something called the National Agricultural Land Study, the first comprehensive look of what was happening to our land. And it had alarming results. We were losing 3 million acres of farmland a year. Now, you'll hear later, or you'll hear if you're a member of AFT, and I hope you are and you get our materials, we get crazed by the fact that we're losing 750,000 acres of farmland a year right now, 2,000 acres a day, and that is way too much. But 40 years ago, it was 4 times that rate. This is something that we have improved on. Such a rate that there was actual concern about the food security of this country if we continued on that path. So in this period, these 2 last items that I mentioned, this tension between farmers and environmentalists and this particular concern about farmland conversion and farmland loss drove to the creation of American Farmland Trust in 1980. And I want to tell a little bit about the story of our founding because I think it's illustrative. So the woman shown here is Peggy Rockefeller, married to one of the richest men in America. She could have done anything with her life, but she was a true farm girl at heart, and she was also an ardent environmentalist. And in the late 1970s, she was on the board of the Nature Conservancy. Now, the Nature Conservancy does some amazing work, and today does a lot of amazing work in partnership with farmers, but didn't at all back in the 1970s. So Peggy teed up to TNC's board, we need to think about this differently. We have to recognize that farmers are good stewards and that farming and environmental issues are 2 sides of the same coin. We need to get involved in that space. I don't know how anyone says no to Peggy Rockefeller, but TNC's board said no. So she and the team she had assembled, and she assembled some amazing people. One went on to become a MacArthur Genius Award winner. Another was Fred Winthrop, who was the Commissioner of Agriculture in Massachusetts, who had done some of the most progressive agricultural work there. So, she chose a young farmer from California who later became AFT's president, Ralph Grassi. Many of you might know him by reputation, who had started the first agricultural land trust in the country. The first president of AFT was the head of the National Historic Preservation Association, an amazing group she had assembled. And when TNC said no, she went to Audubon. They said no. They went to farm groups. They all said no. Why? Because all of these groups had defined themselves as being against the other. And it would be against really almost their values to embrace a bigger perspective. So the only answer was to found a new organization, and that's where American Farmland Trust came from. Now, remember how different the world was in 1980, right? At that time, there was no agricultural land trust communities. Organizations like Maine Farmland Trust did not exist. There was one, the Marin Agricultural Land Trust, started by Ralph Grassi, who I just mentioned, and he actually helped found it in '79, a year before AFT, but AFT held easements on ag land before Malt did. So AFT had the first true agricultural easements ever placed on property. There was no recognition of agricultural conservation easements in federal law, no mention of it, and certainly no charitable contribution for donated easements. There was not a dime of money for farmland protection at the federal level, and at the state level, there was one program, Massachusetts, in the whole country. AFT has now helped bring about over 70 programs, 28 at state level. When you talk about farming practices, because from the beginning it's about more than land, it's also about what you're doing on that land. You've got to look at this comprehensively. Everything that we now think about in the Farm Bill that supports better conservation, in the conservation title, so-called Title II of the Farm Bill, didn't exist. Didn't exist. That was the landscape back then. And AFT, maybe because of being in the right place, and by the way, I'm bragging, but I can't because I wasn't there, right? It had nothing to do with me. I have the real honor of standing on the shoulders of giants. But AFT, out of nothing, really created this movement. We passed early on in 1981 the Farmland Protection Policy Act that recognized the value of our land to our future and put some constraints on federal funding that could be used for projects that would hurt farmland. In 1985, we developed the coalition. We did exactly what we said we were going to do. We brought together environmental and agricultural groups and formed something called the Conservation Coalition. And that resulted in the inclusion in the 1985 Farm Bill of the conservation title. I won't bore folks here about this because you're not all farmers, but this is big stuff. This has resulted in about $120 billion worth of funding that has flowed to farmers in the last 37 years to do the right stuff on the land, to be able to be good stewards of that land. And then we did other things. We helped create a whole range of agricultural land trusts, including, as you heard, Maine Farmland Trust. When we were, I'd been working on farm issues in Maine for a long time. When we saw one of the mapping studies from American Farmland Trust. It didn't tell us anything we didn't know about farmland loss in Maine, but it crystallized it, it documented it, and we literally went to AFT's offices in Saratoga Springs. I didn't, a member of this group did. His daughter was in graduate school there. Knocked on the door of AFT's offices, and AFT gave us support and help to found Maine Farmland Trust. Anyway, I could go on and on about this stuff. I won't. I just wanted to paint that landscape of how far we have come. It really is a whole different place in agriculture and conservation than it was 40 years ago. AFT focuses in 3 different areas. We're all about keeping farmers on the land. By our estimates, we've provided some kind of support to about 500,000 farmers over the last 42 years. We're all about farming practices. One of the things we did when Reagan came into office, the person who had been heading the Soil Conservation Service Remember, begun by Henry Wallace many years before. Finally, in the 70s, there was a new head of the Soil Conservation Service, a man by the name of Norm Berg, and Norm really became the champion of conservation practices in the modern era. But he lost his job when Reagan came, so we grabbed him. We also grabbed Robert Gray, who had developed the National Ag Land Study. So early on in AFT's activities, we had the national expert on land loss and the national expert on conservation practices on our team. Very powerful. And of course, I just alluded to the fact that we're really often associated, it's only part of what we do, but with protecting farmland and through the use of agricultural conservation easements. So one of the ways we work to protect farmland is, we don't operate in every state. We go deep in some states, light in others, where there's a viable partner like Maine Farmland Trust. We don't have to do a lot of work here. They're doing great work, right? But we do on the national level a lot of research and policy work that helps everybody. And one thing we've done since the National Ag Land Study, back in the late 1970s, since we've existed, we became the place that USDA looks to for that data. We compile data that they collect, we analyze it, and we give it back to them. Very powerful. And Farms Under Threat is the title of our latest effort in this area. It's been an ongoing project for several years. One of our reports came out 2 years ago. It was called Farms Under Threat, State of the States, and it documented the loss of farmland. This is where that 750,000 acres a year figure that I mentioned earlier came from, using some techniques in detail that has never existed before. And we also looked at what's happening at the state level, state policies that are driving this. Great report. This and everything I'm going to touch on today is available on our website or at the Farmland Information website, and I urge you to go in there. I'm just going to touch on it today. So that was 2 years ago, a very important report, and one of the things it showed is that we're losing farmland everywhere. A lot of people think, oh, farmland resources, that's sort of a Midwestern thing or pockets in California Central Valley. It's not really that. There is good farmland everywhere, and there are people everywhere, and we need to grow food everywhere, and we are losing it everywhere. It is not just on the urban edge. That might be where the subdivision is taking it over. But what is referred to as low-density rural development, that one house that's in the middle of what was a 50-acre field, in essence taking it out of production in the future, is just as bad. Maybe worse in a way, because society is not getting the benefit of 100 homes from that. They're just getting one home with a damn big lawn that is doing nobody any good. So one of the messages of that study was the problem is everywhere. The latest iteration of Farms Under Threat we just released this past spring, and we called it Farms Under Threat 2040 because we used very sophisticated computer modeling to look at what will happen in the future under different scenarios. What will happen by the year 2024? One of those scenarios is what we refer to as business as usual. We just sort of keep doing things as we are. And by our estimation, we will lose 18.4 million more acres of farmland in this country if that happens. The next scenario is what we refer to as runaway sprawl. There's nothing that says that some of the constraints that have been put on the last few years are going to last. And we've seen that just since the pandemic. This is data through 2016 in most cases. We've seen a real interest in rural properties in particular. But there's a third scenario as well, and it's one that embraces smart growth. In this idea that of smart growth keeping development where it really should be. In our cities, in our village centers, rather than out in sprawling land. The study also looks specifically at Maine. There's a map at Maine. You can't really tell much from looking at that, but again, go on the website. You can drill down to every county, every community. You can see exactly what is happening on the land and what could happen on the land. The summary data for Maine is this. Under the business as usual scenario will lose about 53,000 more acres of farmland. You know, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but I hope I'll make the point before I end today that any loss of farmland is really too much. And it does equate to a number of farms and a number of businesses. That is 400 farms. That's $32 million in annual economic activity. It would be continuing time and time again, and about 1,400 jobs. In the hardest hit counties would be Somerset and Aroostook, but also Cumberland, right down in this part of southern Maine. Here again, a snip from the website, but it shows what's happening outside of Portland, or what could happen outside of Portland under different scenarios. And again, I urge you to go and look at the website and get more detail. This is a planner's dream. If you are a planner, you will love this stuff. I haven't mentioned one factor which could actually significantly elevate the conversion of farmland, and that is solar development. We obviously need solar energy. It's critically important to meet our climate goals, and yet we have to be smart about it. This is analogous in my mind to the smart growth movement. In fact, American Farmland Trust refers to its principles on solar as smart solar. Smart growth has never said we shouldn't have development. It said, let's do it in the right way, in the right places. And that's the same thing with solar. Let's prioritize rooftops and brownfields and marginal land. There is going to have to be some solar on decent farmland too. DOE's estimates are 10 million acres of solar development, and likely 90% of that will be in rural areas. And Princeton came out with a study 2 weeks ago that said when you add in transmission and storage, it might be twice that amount. So there's going to be some, but let's do it smart. And without going through all of AFT's principles, again, they're on the website, but beyond just prioritizing it in the right places, where it is going to go beyond farmland, we need to make sure that we're protecting soil health when we both build it and when we decommission it, so that land could still be used for food production in the future. And we need to explore what is referred to as dual use or agrivoltaics. Very innovative ideas, still some of them being worked out, where farming and solar production can go hand in hand. So this is the landscape. A lot of pressures on our farmland. And I guess the question is, well, do we really need all this farmland? Well, yes. And I can sit down now. No, we really do. And it is because some people recognize that we need it to grow our food. But what they don't get is we need it for so much more than just growing our food. Farmland provides a whole range of critically important ecological services. Wildlife habitat, water recharge, I can go on and on, right? Critically important stuff, including carbon sequestration. Climate crisis, it's the issue of our day. I sometimes say that the world changed on October 6th, 2018. That's the day that the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made this statement. They said, as important as it is for us to reduce carbon emissions, doing that alone will never be enough for us to reach the goals of the Paris Climate Accords. We must also capture atmospheric carbon and put it back in the soil. And farming can do that. Farming is this amazing thing that can both grow our food and be part of our climate solution. You'll hear about regenerative farming. You'll hear about climate smart ag. Don't get hung up on the definitions. The point is there are a number of farming practices, specific practices, that can take atmospheric carbon and restore it to the soil. No-till, cover crops, rotations, etc. Again, go to AFT's website. We have a tool where you can look at every county that has what is happening on the ground now with farms and what the potential is of those very farms to sequester carbon through new practices. Very powerful tool. So farming done right can do so much. It can actually be more than just offsetting the amount of carbon that farming itself produces, which is about 10% of our emissions in the US. It can actually go further and offset emissions from other sectors if we do it right. But I want to point out that it's a system, and all these parts are connected. What happens on the land with the land itself and with the people who do the work. And one connection that's really important for us to remember is the connection back to the land itself. With every acre of farmland we lose, we not only lose the potential of that land to grow food, but also to provide these critical services, including carbon capture. But we also put additional pressure on all the remaining land to be farmed in a more intensive way that will not have the environmental benefits that we need. We cannot maximize regenerative practices, those that are going to sequester carbon on land and simultaneously maximize food production. We can optimize, we can't maximize both. So we're only going to realize the results we need if we have enough farmland. And you know, we don't know how much farmland we need. We honestly don't know. All the analysis has only been around food, not around other environmental services. But and AFT is trying to work on this. It's a complicated, big, multi-million-dollar, multi-year research project. But I can guarantee one outcome. Long before we run out of the land we need to grow our food, we will run out of the land we need to restore our planet. It's that simple. So this is where the cautionary principle needs to be right up there front and center. I don't have the time to go into this, but I hear all sorts of reasons why farmland's not important, and they're all wrong, and I can tell you about it over lunch. So what are the policy recommendations from this latest report? Well, we need to encourage smart growth. We need to protect more of our farmland. We need to advance smart solar siting. Those things are all incredibly important, and we need to get new farmers on the land because they're going to be the ones who do the work. We need to begin to thinking about planning for agriculture, not around it. AFT has been in this space for a long time. We're about to, one of my staffers is about to publish what I think will be the definitive book on this subject. It's going to the publishers in January. But it's exciting and important stuff. And I won't go through this either. I want to end, I only have a couple minutes left, and I want to end by going back to what I said at the beginning. And you'll recall that it was, I wasn't a child here in Maine. I was born in Boston, and my father, when I was quite young, was quite suddenly and quite tragically, I guess it couldn't not be tragic, murdered. And my mother, seeking sort of to give some sense of stability and comfort to the family, seeking maybe escape appropriately, picked up the family and moved us to, of all places, Nantucket Island. Very different world than the 1960s. She ended up remarrying a ninth-generation Islander, which is about what you needed to be part of that community. And I became part of the fabric of a very close-knit rural community, which nurtured and healed me, to be perfectly honest. My stepdad died when I was in high school. I'm the youngest of 5. In sophomore year in high school, my mother decided to be closer to my daughters who had moved off island. She sold the house and went. This was, 1980, 1981. This coincided with a dramatic increase in property values. Dramatic. And I don't like to focus on funding, but money, but this is a good example. My mother sold a house for $125,000 that 6 years later sold for $3.2 million. 40-time increase in 6 years. So I was home, I was on Nantucket, not in my house, visiting a friend during a reflective summer between college and graduate school. And I realized I could never go home. I was economically prevented from ever going back to my home. And it dawned on me that rural places do one of two things. They either wither on the vine and become economic ghost towns, or they become rich and trendy and overpriced. But either way, there are no opportunities for local people to be there and make a go of it. So I decided that was going to be the focus of my life. And it became the focus of a lot of what I did in graduate school. And as soon as myself and my new wife had the opportunity, we moved to Maine to make a go of it. And I was working for the state at that time. I had a degree from MIT, so I could pretend I understood certain things. And I was hired to be the associate director of the Maine Science and Technology Commission. Doesn't exist now, became MTI. But I was doing all this great stuff to help small businesses, help grow the place without spoiling the place. But I got engaged in the local community because that's part of my interests. And I found myself co-chairing the Comprehensive Plan Committee with a dairy farmer. Well, after he got to know me a little, he sized me up as only a farmer can do. And he said, John, you say you care about rural development. You say you care about these issues. You know absolutely nothing about farming. And he was right. He was right. We always had a big garden. I loved food. I knew nothing about farming. And in a moment of rare humility, I agreed with him. And he took me under his wing, and he became the first of what ended up being 30-plus years of mentors. And I went from, like a lot of people 30-plus years ago, thinking that there was no future for farming in New England. Anyone who wanted to farm figured out there was better soil out west and left, to recognizing that farming is one of those things that is truly of this place. And if we were serious about talking about sustainable rural development, we had to have agriculture at the heart of it. And that's how my journey of the last 30 years began. We all have our journeys. We're going to talk about advocacy, I believe, and there's many ways to get engaged. But I think it starts with that personal journey of you just committing to something that is going to make the world better. So thank you for your time. It's great to be here. It's great to be home.
I'm a little teary because I got up really early and didn't have a ton of coffee. So it's not hard to set me off. And I wake up every single morning on a dairy farm, and half the time I wonder, why are we doing it? What are we doing it for? What am I doing to my children? We farm in a fishbowl. There is an actual housing development next to my dairy farm in Mid-Coast, Maine. We have 80 acres of farmland in Mid-Coast, Maine on Route 1. And there is a housing development that used to be a farm next to my farm. And those people have to put up with the fact that they live next to a dairy farm. We're not a flower and vegetable farm. It's not beautiful, but it's not another housing development. And so I want to thank John so much for those fantastic words. I get a lot of pinch me moments in this role, and definitely one of them is being able to be with such thoughtful people. And I would put a plug in for the Ken Burns Dust Bowl right now, because it's a life changer. Whether you farm or not, if you breathe, you want to watch that series. And if you're a PBS Passport member, you can. So next, I get to introduce. I'm going to keep the bio very brief because Mike can talk about himself. Mike McGinn is here from America Walks. So he's the executive director of America Walks now. He's an activist turned politician turned activist simultaneously. So we're going to see how all of that blends together. And I want to appreciate the fact, as Mike comes up to talk about his work, that he has taken on sort of this intersectionality role in those spaces too. When we talk about disability rights and we talk about climate, a lot of the work that Mike's been engaged in touches on a lot of those things. Mike, please come on up. Thanks so much.
It's so great to see such a full room. It's been a while, right, of being in a room with other people and connecting. And I've given so many talks to Zoom, and to actually be talking to people Thank you. Thank you all for being here. So yeah, America Walks. We support local advocacy for walkable, accessible, and equitable, I'd add inclusive places. And we're a voice for walkability at the national level. And I invite you all to go to americawalks.org. I ask you to sign up. And just a brief comment about places. I mean, walkability is not an urban issue, right? We're in Biddeford, and it's a town or a city. Even the smallest village was built around the school and the chapel and the places of employment and the places to stay. So you can almost, I look at places and I see the places that were built around people walking, and then there were maybe places built around the streetcar stops, and then there were places built around cars. And even the farms were built around walking and taking the trip to town. And it's really the places around cars that we're having the biggest problem with right now as we try to look at building that resilient future that John was talking about. I want to thank you for sharing your personal story. And my personal story isn't going to be as inspiring. I'm just going to put that on the table right now. That was really, but it was really illustrative. I almost want to throw out all my slides and start breaking apart what John just did here, but we'll get to that in a minute. So this is me, 3 kids. They don't look like that anymore, although I will say that Jack, the one on the lower right there, made the same face at me the other day. I was a lawyer in private practice. I'd managed to move from Long Island to DC and work for a congressman and who was from the West Coast. I went out to Seattle to law school. I was a volunteer in the Sierra Club, and we just bought a house in a new neighborhood. And I have to say, my wife says this about me. She says, you always cared about, the environment, but after having kids, you really seemed to take it a lot more seriously. And that was really true. And it turned out my new house was in a neighborhood, it's Seattle, it's a city, but it was past the old city line. We didn't have sidewalks, that you can even see that car got a little too far over into the drainage ditch. And so even though I was, engaged in a lot of things, this was kind of my first project that was mine. It's like, we're gonna get sidewalks in my neighborhood and make it so it's walkable. And I got engaged in the local neighborhood community council and local neighborhood planning. And one thing led to another, but I want to say, it was years, it was lots of meetings. There were people that opposed it. You're going to make it hard for me to drive to the grocery store. People told me in the neighborhood, I was shocked. I leafleted the neighborhood, got everyone down to the community council, and it took a long time, but we did get sidewalks in the neighborhood. At the same time, I became president of the local community council. It was a neighborhood 7 miles from downtown. It had a nice little business district, but in addition to having the old buildings like Biddeford had, it also had, this is the McDonald's and the auto-oriented development that was right next to the neighborhood business district. Got really involved with folks locally. We had the city agencies there, we had the property owner, we had neighbors there, we did this neighborhood planning. And this is just a zoning map. There's like literally the old streetcar stop there at that intersection at 85th and Greenwood with big box stores over to the left in that image. And we ended up putting in a new street where the McDonald's was and building buildings up to the street line and really restoring the walkable grid. Again, years, lots of meetings, but it's something that every time I walk past that in my neighborhood, I feel really good about. Well, one thing had led to another. And I quit my job as a lawyer and started working with other folks and formed a nonprofit. And we actually teamed up with a land conservancy in the region. At the time, Cascade Land Conservancy, now called Forterra, and they were working to preserve the landscape of the region, and the farmlands and forest lands and wilderness. And they were one of my supporters in founding this nonprofit. They were an early major donor, because in order to save that, you needed to work in places to build great places. And I was really highly motivated by climate. And there just simply wasn't any way to get at the climate issue without focusing on the land use and transportation issues. We needed to live in walkable places, what we're now calling 15-minute neighborhoods. But I wanted to create something that was open to people for various reasons. They could come into it for whatever reason they wanted. It was more about a sense of place than it was about an issue. And we were having success. We got a parks levy on the ballot, by the way. That's Allison Burson, who is now the Northeast Regional Director of East Coast Greenway. She's moving to Maine. You want to meet her and get her on your board. I shouldn't say yes to all of you. And we got that on the ballot, and we passed it. We passed complete streets legislation. We worked on zoning issues. This is all the mid-2000s. So we were kind of in advance of a lot of the movement you now see around things like backyard cottages and missing middle housing. But those are the types of things we were pushing. I also got pulled into this fight on a regional ballot measure. There was this roads and transit ballot measure, and through the Sierra Club, we worked to oppose it. They had very cynically attached transit expansion to a major highway expansion. And we said, no, it's bad for climate. You should vote that down, come back with transit alone. And it's funny, at that point, I was engaged in, as a local Sierra Club leader, I was at a reception the night before the U.S. Conference of Mayors were coming to town to talk about climate. And the deputy mayor came up to me and said, you guys in the Sierra Club aren't going to do anything to mess with our conference, are you? And I smiled, and the answer was yes, we were. All the cameras were going to be there, and we got our kids in polar bear outfits, and sure enough, we got a lot of coverage of it. We beat that roads and transit ballot measure, and the next year, light rail came back alone and passed. And we beat it even though we were really, really outspent. They had 5 million, we had about 50,000, but we just had a great message and great organizing. Which, you know, I also worked to get rid of a highway on the waterfront and not replace it with another highway in Seattle. I lost that fight. You know, we ultimately built a tunnel on the waterfront at billions and billions of dollars, which was disappointing. But it's in part being part of that fight and everything else I did, not something I really planned in advance, but in the middle of all of that, I decided to run for mayor of Seattle, which I won, and you know, was in office for 4 years. And I could talk a lot about things we did and why we did it. And I'm kind of telling you this story because I didn't start working on sidewalks in my neighborhood because I was planning to run for mayor, right? It was like one thing led to another. It just happened. And not only did it just happen, it was an extraordinarily rewarding experience. It forced me to get out of my own space. It forced me to work with others. And even though I was highly motivated by climate, the act of getting onto city stakeholder committee exposed me to so many other people in the community, you know, the immigrant and refugee communities of Seattle. And I know Maine as well, you know, has immigrant and refugee communities here. Meeting Latino leaders, meeting Black leaders, and changing how I thought about the world, changing how I approach my advocacy, changing me. And so it's just extraordinarily rewarding work. Really loved doing it. Of course, lost a close race for re-election, was really disappointed. So what did I do? Well, you know, everything else in my life was pretty good, you know, other than losing a race for mayor. So I started volunteering again and working with people that I enjoyed working with. And one thing led to another, and now I'm the executive director of America Walks. Really just blessed with this gift of really critical work. I mean, you're all here because you know how critical it is. And John illustrated it as well. It's not just that we need to shave a few points off of emissions, right? It's like we have within our grasp the ability, if we change the way we live upon the land, if we can live in walkable communities, right? If we can provide abundant housing, if we can reduce the costs of getting around by making places walkable and transit-friendly and bikeable, you know, we can improve equity. You know, we can build community. We can enjoy these things together. So I'm just, you know, feel an immense gift to be able to continue to engage in this work. And I also know that I also continue to get to meet and work with people who care like I do. So I'm committed to it. You're here, you're committed to it. How do you get things done, right? We know what needs to be done. How do you get things done is the hardest question. And, you know, I told you my story, and John told you his story, because I'm going to skip ahead a slide. This is something called public narrative, right? There's two ways of knowing. There's one way of knowing, which is to think about and know about the issues. I could have, and I tend to do this, shown you slides about how the world works, why walking reduces emissions, why walkable communities are critical, and the rest. And that's important. That's the issues and the strategy and all the rest. But we also know the world through emotion. And that's really critical as well, because the job of organizing is to move people from head, they know what's right, to heart, they feel it's right, to hands, to taking action. How do they act on what's right? And I talk about the two ways of knowing. I think about this within the Sierra Club, and you may have experienced in your own things. When you decide to have a committee, we often reach for the person who's most knowledgeable about the issue to head that committee. Oh, from the transportation subcommittee, we need to know the person who really knows all the ins and outs of transportation. Well, you want that person on your committee, but I think you actually want the person who's the leader, motivator, relationship builder, organizer. Well, who's the organizer? Who's an organizer? Well, I don't know, have you ever gotten everyone to agree on a restaurant? You know, you're an organizer. You know, you're getting all the kids out of the house at roughly the right time with roughly what they need. You're an organizer. We're all organizers in our daily lives. And the story I just told you, and I'll go back, let's see if I can do that. This idea of public narrative is something, and I really encourage you to read the works of Marshall Gans. He was a Harvard graduate who ended up dropping out of school, worked with Cesar Chavez for years. And the quote I've heard is, you know, somebody asked Cesar Chavez, what's the secret to organizing? And his answer was, well, first you speak to one person, then you speak to another person, then you speak to another person. You know, and in some ways it's as simple as that. And the story of self, and John shared his story of self with you, the why he got in. I've shared some of my story of self with you and what motivates me and how I got engaged, is really important. People need to hear your story of self, why you're engaged. Marshall Gans calls it self, us, now. In Washington, for some reason, we interpreted it to you, me, us, now. Because part of telling your story of self is meeting someone else and pulling their story of self out of them, who they are, what motivates, and what moves them. One of the things I learned, and I'm somebody who's, you know, I can policy wonk with the best of them, and I took office as mayor, and probably the thing I learned most was that politics runs on emotion, not logic. If politics ran on logic, oh my God. Oh my God, so many things we do differently, but it doesn't. It runs on emotion. And being able to connect with people on an emotional level and understand emotions and share your own emotions is important to building, you know, the effort. And so finding in yourself your own story. Why are you engaged? Why does it matter? Why are you working? And going out and meeting other people in your community, and not just people in your own demographic or social bubble, but particularly reaching out to others who are also in the space and asking them for their story. You will learn, you will change. You will change how you think about issues, you will change how you approach issues. And they'll appreciate that, and they'll trust you more when that time comes to actually ask to work together. And I'd say that's the next piece then, is the story of us, right? And this is the public narrative, is finding that story of how we as a community have faced challenges before and we fixed them. So this is public narrative, right? We've faced these challenges. We are strong, you know, we are willing to confront hard issues together, and we will do this now, together. And the now part, well, that's when you start getting to strategy and tactics. We're gonna win this election race. We're gonna pass this ballot measure. We're gonna build a coalition to build sidewalks in our neighborhood, right? We're gonna work together on the plan. And so this idea of public narrative is really critical, and I can't go into all of the details about how to build one or how to do it. I just invite you to look at that yourself. We talked about two ways of knowing. You know, the key to motivation, you know, is understanding that values inspire action through emotion. I think I've covered this, right? That that this is one of the ways in which you engage the issues and engage with other people. And I said earlier, moving from head to heart to hands, I think a lot of the work of organizing is giving each other courage, right? There's a lot of reasons we don't act. You know, I told that story about the deputy mayor, because I was now a person of, you know, some modest importance in the city. I don't want to say I was much of one. There were lots of people like me, right? Leader of a group of people that were representing, you know, some values in the community. And, you know, the deputy mayor was telling me, you're going to risk that if you mess with our conference, right? It takes a little bit of courage. And, you know, it took us a little bit of courage. And we find that courage in others. That's the other job of organizing. So you can look at the reasons why people don't act, right? Whether it's inertia, apathy, fear, isolation, self-doubt. I can't do this. Well, you can do this. Of course you can. Other people have. Other people have stepped up. And, you know, you replace them. You can see here the chart shares with you, you know, what replaces each of those emotions. But again, you're going to find them collectively through that public narrative. And there's also, I don't know, I'll tell one more story, a couple more stories around power. I mean, power is kind of an ugly word to a lot of us, right? It feels like power is the thing used by the bully to oppress or by the powerful to deny. But, you know, a community, a group, organizations need to create power with each other to counteract that power. And we've been talking about how to do that. And sometimes you think you can't do it, but I had this experience when I was mayor. We'd had a crime wave, and you know, we've had more murders. We were calling members of the community in, and the black pastors, when I met with them, told me, you know, a lot of these crimes are from people who are coming out of jail who don't have any other opportunities. Help fund us. Don't just give them counselors for housing or for job training. Connect them with other community members who will be their partners and help them get through this. That made sense to me as an organizer, right? Like we get strength from each other as people. And so we launched a program called Career Bridge. And I ended up going into the state prison and meeting with the prisoners of the Black Prisoners Caucus. And, you know, I could sense there was a lot of fear and self-doubt. They were in a tough place. They'd made some bad turns to get there. And they were thinking about what it meant to get out. And when we left, Mary Flowers, who was the human services person who helped set up the meeting, told me that that idea for Career Bridge wasn't the black pastors, it was theirs. Think about that. The Black Prisoners Caucus met every month in the jail. If you want to think about people that don't have power, but they organized, they overcome their fears and doubts, they asked for help, they found help, and now there was a program that was started for them. You know, another example I think of is Maru Mora is a Latina in Seattle, undocumented immigrant, but she'd been living in the country for years. Her daughter had been raised in the country, and she got just super highly motivated about prisons for profit in the region. And so she started organizing protests to stop the buses bringing undocumented immigrants into the prison. And the fact was that people inside learned about it and did hunger strikes. And that ultimately led to Obama taking notice, and just recently, the governor said no more prisons for profit for detainees. Like the incentives are all wrong for prisons for profit, right? They make their money by putting people in prison. It's just the incentives are all wrong. And she did all of this as an undocumented immigrant, and I was interviewing her for a podcast I had, You, Me, Us Now. You can still look it up. I haven't kept it live. And she said, well, I was a person of privilege in my community. And I was thinking, wow, you're an undocumented immigrant? You're a person of privilege? But yeah, I speak English well. I'm well educated. I'm more white appearing than others. And I was in a position to do more. And I was just so inspired by that, because she was like, what's the source of our ability to gain power within the system? And again, she didn't do that alone. She did it by organizing. She did it by talking to others, and other people gave her courage. So I really encourage, you know, I guess I'm telling these stories because I'm encouraging you to realize that you don't have to, you know, everybody has their reason for getting engaged. and everybody, you're here already. You've already taken that step. You're already engaged. I'd really encourage you to think about developing and working on this idea of public narrative and exposing yourself to others and your vulnerabilities and working with others to help, develop that courage to take action. I'll make just a couple more points. One is, what should I work on? I get that a lot from people. People ask me, what should I work on? And you can analyze what's the most important thing to work on, but it's probably what's the thing I'm most useful on, or what am I most helpful on? And that's probably going to be the thing you enjoy doing, because you'll stick with it. So don't worry about what's the most important issue, right? And so that'll inform you. It may inspire you. But really, how can I contribute, and how can I work with others? I think I've said this already. Get outside yourself and talk to others and hear their stories and learn their stories so you can build those bridges for future work. One of the things that I was just blown away by was when I decided to run for mayor, I felt like, it was funny, I was looking at the race, and I was a leader in the community from this sector of, neighborhood, environmental type folks who cared about the issues. And I was looking for who the person was that was going to run that had my values, but nobody was going to run because the incumbent seemed to have all the money and all the institutional endorsements. And it all of a sudden dawned on me that, oh my God, the door was open for someone like me to run. And I had all the values. I had my own values, so that turned out to be a match, what I was looking for. So I got in, and I had a sense I could win because I had done these races and I had friends that I had worked on campaigns with. Like I'd learned and I really want to say I was very fortunate to be involved in the Sierra Club, which at the time was an organization, and may still be, that was an organization that valued grassroots volunteers and actually tried to develop them and give them power, to do things. And I think that's the other thing, is how do you not just gain more capacity and ability yourself, but how do you bring other people along and give them capacity and ability? And that was done for me. So I decided to run. I started talking to people. People just started showing up, and because they knew me and they'd worked with me. And again, we were way outspent and we won. So build those relationships, because you just never know when that's going to come to support you. And the last observation I'll make, and my daughter repeats this back to me because she likes it, being right is easy, winning is hard. It's really easy to be right, just, check in on yourself. I think that's what Twitter is. I think like 90% of Twitter is, I am right, I was right, or I'm going to be right. It's one of those three. But being right is easy. Winning is hard, and winning takes that getting outside of yourself and really challenging your own fears and helping others challenge their own fears and doubts about how they can contribute to the world. So that's, when I lost my race for mayor, I said I was disappointed, and so that's what I did. I just started working again with people again, and they helped give me the support to kind of get involved in stuff. And again, everything in my life was good except for losing a mayor's race. I don't want to make believe there was any great struggle here. But I did find strength and encouragement and reward from working with others. I'll make one more observation, just kind of a little more nuts and bolts about it. I wish somebody had told me this before I was mayor, but when they told me afterwards, it all made sense to me. If you want change, as between elected officials, agency officials, and the public, you need 2 out of 3. Nobody had ever, and I looked back on everything. It really made sense to me. There were things I wanted to do as mayor, but there was no public demand. I needed the public demand to make that happen. There were things that if the agency folks were like, no, you can't do that. That bike lane will disrupt traffic too much, right? I needed somebody in the public to make the demand, to make that happen. And I'd felt that as an advocate, but now I knew it as a mayor. The other thing I put this out there is because I know people are in different places. A lot of what I've been talking about is the work of the advocate and the building public demand. And if you're in an agency, you have a different set of constraints on you. I still think being able to put yourself in a public narrative and be able to share who you are, why you care, what matters, and why you're engaged still helps. But obviously, nobody who worked for that deputy mayor was going to show up with their kids in a polar bear outfit that day, like we did. Like, there are just different constraints on where you are, and there are different constraints on elected officials, too. You can act quickly on things you campaigned on, but on new issues, you have to give time to the public to weigh in before the elected official weighs in. Otherwise, you don't come across right. So, and who knows? If you take the time to listen to other people before you take an action, you just might learn something. So where you are in the system and what draws you, and there are people who are drawn to each of these. And again, like, where are you most useful? Where do you feel you can be most productive? Where you can feel to help the most? There's not a right or wrong answer to where you're supposed to go. It's the answer is where you think you can contribute the most, where it makes sense for you, and recognizing that people have different roles in this space. But I hope this also helps you think about, when you're building a campaign, how are you going to get 2 out of 3, right? And I think it always starts with public demand. So I'll stop there. I got some other slides about other topics, but my close is simply thank you for making the commitment you've made to trying to create, a better place, for your family, for your community members, for your kids. It is, the most meaningful work there can be, and it has been for me the most rewarding work. And I look forward to an opportunity to help you from our position at America Walks in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. I forgot to mention that Mike is psychic in his intro and bio. So a lot of the things that he touched on and addressed are actually things that I had sort of planned on asking him and John to talk about, which is kind of great because, and one of the things that I feel really, really grateful that you brought up is actually sometimes the inherent risk that can be felt in standing up, in taking your passion and turning that into action, and then further turning that into policy. I grew up poor in small town rural Maine, and so I stand here fully inhabiting the privilege that I have as a middle-aged white lady in Maine. I realize that I don't stick my neck out pretty far these days when I talk about the things that I feel strongly about. But as a very young person, I hopped on my first bus to Washington, D.C. at 15. I think that's when I started my action career, threw tennis balls at the White House, and I felt very radical. They had messages on them. I think one of them was definitely like, I'm going to vote one day, so better watch out. I reported on the Reagan-Mondale election for my 3rd grade class. I knew that there was a pathway for having my ideas and my voice heard somewhere, that there was going to be some space that I could inhabit to make things better, but I had no idea how to access that. And many of us come from very small places in Maine. We came here today from very small places in Maine. And I think we know how risky it can be sometimes to even put a sign in your yard, let alone go to a town meeting and stand up and tell people that you think something very differently than them. Because you also need them to come pick up, your trash or drive your kid home from school safely, or, all of the things that we rely on one another to do in our communities. So how do we create change? How do we take our passion and make that into, I like to use the hashtag all the time. Privately, I use it in my head. My Twitter is pretty managed these days. But I use that policy for the people. How do we take our passion and turn that into policy for the people and create that accessibility? And so I think I'll start there with our discussion, and we're going to chat a little bit, and then there's going to be some time to take questions from the audience. And I'm looking over here for a moment. Do you want me to move and sit down? Should I move and sit down? Okay. All right, I'll have a seat. And then we'll start our discussion. But I want to start, Mike, with you. So talking about that inherent risk You know, how do we access those levers to pull?
You know, I guess I'm on? Yeah. So, you know, we were talking about, I can think of a number of times where it's really much easier to do it when you're with other people. It really is. And you can sort that out and work it out and work out your message and work out where you're going. I was struck, you know, so that's one piece of it. It really is good. If there's something you care about, to sit down. I think the other reason I talked about being able to put your own story of self out there is one community member talking to another community member is really powerful. You know, I was thinking as mayor, I would show up and to a town hall where it seemed like everybody was mad at me because of something the city was doing. But as soon as somebody in the community said, no, actually, I think it's great that we're redesigning the street for safety and putting in, you know, some bike lanes and making it easier to cross. I live in the neighborhood. A conversation between community members is a lot different than one with two electeds. So, but entering that space with that, you know, I am a member of the community and here are my hopes and fears and values, I think is important. And I also think it is hard what you're talking about. I remember I was at a community council meeting and people were railing about the townhouses going up in the neighborhood. Right? They were all against it, evil developers and all those townhouses. And I was just sitting there and I disagreed with everybody. And I was thinking, how do I enter the space? And finally I said, well, you know, I gotta say, for a lot of young families, that's the one thing they can afford right now in Seattle. And I gotta say, the tenor of the conversation changed because we were talking about the hopes of other community members. I didn't start with, let me show you the data on why this is good for housing prices, right? Which is, I think something we do, and I don't want to speak for all of you, maybe it's just something I do, but I see that a lot, you know, but so finding the emotional core of something and the personal core and relating it to the people in the community and what they care about, I think is important, and of course entering with respect for other people. I think that's the other thing, is with the national conversation the way it is, and everybody in camps, and it's only gotten worse in my years of watching it. When you're in the community, it's different. You know, I could find allies in my neighborhood. As mayor, I could find unlikely allies. Like, there were people who were dead set against me in a bike lane in some community, and they ended up coming around and supporting me in my reelection. And I said, why? I thought you guys hated that bike lane. They said, yeah, but your door was open and we could talk to you. So again, that goes back to that idea of really getting outside of your own space and talking to other people and hearing them, because then you can approach those issues with a better understanding of their hopes and fears as well, their emotions, and try to come at them in a way that could find some common ground. Now, I don't want to make believe that if you just explain everything and you're wonderfully empathetic, that everybody's going to agree, right? And that was one of the slides I didn't show. Right? There are issues where if you just explain it, it flips. If people just understood, it flips. But there's a lot of issues where there's actually somebody on the other side who fervently believes in the opposite thing you do, and they're working to organize. And you're not necessarily going to change their mind. You're trying to collect and bring together and organize the people who agree with you, and you're trying to reach the people in the middle so that they see what you're doing. And by the way, if the people who you agree with are open and nice and enthusiastic, that's persuasive on its own. People like joining, right? So that's the other thing. I call that collecting the yeses. Don't start your campaign with trying to convince the no's to change their minds. Nobody goes from no to yes without going through undecided first, right? Start by finding the people who are in your space already. Come together, start working out your broader message, get a deeper understanding of it, get more people, and just kind of move everybody over a notch. Move some of those ardent opponents into passive opponents. Move some of those passive opponents into undecided. Move some of the undecideds into your column. But it all starts with collecting the yeses first. Find your own people first. And by the way, if you can't find any yeses, man, that's an issue, right? That doesn't mean stand up and yell even louder,
right? It really means you got to start listening to what's going on.
So I guess the subject is risk. And first I want to begin by saying that I'm personally wired to be rather risk averse. What I didn't tell you about my stepfather on Nantucket is that he was a commercial fisherman. And I sometimes, when I'm talking to farmers, I talk about how fishermen and farmers have a lot of similarities. They both fiercely independent. They rely on a resource. They have to steward that resource well if they're going to stay in business. And yet I also say there's one big difference, and the big difference is that fishermen get into a hell of a lot more fistfights. And sometimes I use that as a reason to say why I sort of gravitated towards working with farmers, because that is the kind of person I am. I don't like confrontation. And yet, if I look at the things I've done over 35 years in my career, I've done a lot of things that were fairly risky. And so I've tried to assess how and why. And I think for me, it's because I don't like to fail. I'm an overachiever. It's been sort of, I self-analyze myself a lot. You're getting that sense here now. And so I don't like to give up. And even if it's hard to do, if the role of confronting somebody or getting engaged or reaching out and having yet another conversation is the only solution that I see to this problem, I will pursue it. And I'll give you an example of that. I mentioned that I was co-chairing the comp plan committee in unity with a dairy farmer, and this probably began in 1989. And I think it was in 1991, after 2 years of work, and many of you have probably gone through these community processes and a ton of meetings and a whole bunch of back and forth, we bring to town meeting an ordinance. And there's a huge debate. It goes on for a couple hours. It's the core of town meeting that year. And in the end, it loses by a passage of the ordinance by about 3 votes, which in retrospect, I said was the absolute best thing that could have happened, because if it had passed by 3 votes, there would have been all these people who would have thought it was a horrible thing. But anyway, it failed by 3 votes. And one of the outspoken opponents of it was a local guy, Dennis. And I realized this 2 years' worth of work was going down the hill. And this was really good stuff. And we couldn't let that happen. And so as much as it hurt, and it was both risky and hard, I reached out to him. And this was a setting. You guys are from small towns. You know what goes on at town meeting. This stuff is vicious, right? This was a man who was calling me every name in the book. I'd lived in town for maybe 2 or 3 years at that point, so I was a target. It was. But I went up to him and I reached out and I put up my hand and said, Dennis, help us make this better. Work with us on this. And in the next year, we had, I think, 28 public meetings. We went overboard to listen and engage. We passed that ordinance unanimously at the next year at town meeting. And so I have had enough experiences where I've seen that me taking that risk has benefit, that it's reinforced in me that it has value, and thus I've done it again and again. But it's hard to do. It's really hard to do. And Mike said something that I would reinforce, which is when you're with others, it becomes a little easier, right? That you get mutual support. You get encouragement. Go on, John. Go up and talk to Dennis. You can. Yeah, I'm not done to do it, but you can do it.
I love that. And you do anything?
Yeah, no, there is definitely a lot of that. I just want to say that even though even today, maybe not so much, the stakes are a little bit lower where we are, but even today when I'm putting something out there that I know is going to draw some opposition, my heart beats a little harder, even with the level of experience I've had in those issues. And I just know that. It's natural. And oftentimes, you want to know you're on solid ground when you do that, which is why you need others to really test it. You want to have a coalition, right? But, the price of leadership is risk, right? If you don't want to take any risks, and the rewards, if you calculate it right, can be really strong. It can be really strong, and forcing the issue, as John was saying, like sometimes you have to do that to really find where people stand, and I've always thought
sometimes people want to paper over the differences so they can move on without conflict. But if it's something that is in the community that's just going to cause more tension, sometimes it's better to let those things, you have to kind of go through the passage of letting the controversy occur. Again, don't just create it. Make sure you're on solid ground, be entering it empathetically and listening. But sometimes you kind of have to, that is a lot of what campaigning is, actually, is building the tension in order to create a resolution. And you need to build the tension in a way that's going to lead to a resolution. And that's hard. That is hard. And yeah, again, my heart beats harder when I get into those situations too.
I think that's fantastic. And I like the idea, too, of bringing that partnership into spaces where there's lived experience, right? Like having the dairy farmer on your team is clearly a way to overcome that and to also have those people feel empowered, that their lived experience is valuable. You know, I think a lot of people, I'm looking at a lot of young people here. I have young, loud, opinionated people in my house. I don't know where they got it. And I, you know, in that way too, you know, I had a little bit of that sort of imposter syndrome when I was trying to figure out how to manage in those spaces, how to make the change that I wanted to. And I would just encourage everyone, when they do have a passion for something, to actually inhabit that lived experience that you have, that you are bringing, which is just as valuable for those discussions as having, you know, a degree in whatever it is that you're sort of trying to move the needle on, or, you know, having a title that gives you some sort of authority in that space. That lived experience that you're bringing, the reason you feel passionate about that, because it affected you with that personal story, I think leads to coalition building in a way that is just invaluable, you know.
You know, and another observation on this, I'm thinking about this in the transportation sphere. Like, the traffic engineer will tell you the way the road should be built, but, you know, that's embedded in how we build a road are values. There are values around safety, there's values around community, there's values around who has priority in the space, and the values don't belong to the expert. Right. The values belong to the community. And you don't need a title to have, you know, to have a stake in the community. And you don't need a degree to know that this road feels unsafe. And what are you going to do to make it safe? And so that's the other thing is having that safe, when you're in those hard places, it's so funny because you're in a conflict arena, right? And I'm about to use the word, you know, my people I worked with say, okay, before we went into a tough debate or something, they go, what's your safe space? And it was the phrase, it was the values, it was the expression, it was the place you could come back to that was really grounded, rooted, and had support. And, you know, so the safe space in that discussion would be, look, I just want to make sure our streets are safe for everybody. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm here for. Mm-hmm. So always having your safe space and which is rooted in values to express in those hard conflicts. It's not about anything else, and it's a community value.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think, John, you've been incredibly successful at that, right? Clearly your passion is the space that you decided to focus your work and that value sharing, you know, which is great. I do want to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience, so if you have, I see one in the back, if you would do me a huge favor when you stand up. Is there a microphone circulating in the audience? There is not. Okay. Okay, I will repeat the question. Or, yeah, I guess we can share. And
we can share up here.
And if you would just share your name and the organization that you're from or community that you're from.
Lee Burnett, Local Woodworks Initiative. Question for John. In farmland conservation and also in carbon sequestration, do you see a farmland forest conflict? And if so, how do you manage it?
It's a good question. And sometimes farmers, I think folks who manage woodlots have it easy because from your perspective, you can really look at a stand of trees, you know what the management plan is, you know what soil conditions are, and you can come up with a pretty good estimation on the back of an envelope of what the carbon sequestration of that woodland is going to be. with farming practices, it's a lot more complicated. You're not pulling, it's not the fiber that you're growing, it's what you're doing to build the soil organic matter. And even though we know there's a whole range of practices that do that, they vary greatly from one farm to another, depending on soil type, depending on when the practices are utilized, et cetera, et cetera. So point number one is they're very different. They're sequestering carbon in different ways, and one, unfortunately, is a little harder to measure, which is part of the reason why we haven't had as much activity there, because it's hard to do things like sell credits when you can't quantify, even though we know it has public good, which is the reason for public investment. But that's another story. We won't go down that. But to your question about the conflict between the two, I don't think one is better than the other. I think they're both useful. In agriculture, we talk a lot about crop rotations, and I'm actually a fan of us thinking about 100-year and 200-year rotations. There's land that is under woods in Maine, which I think should be growing crops, and there's land that is growing crops that I think its next crop should be trees again. And there are very valuable strategies also. You can cut down a woodland, you can clear cut and turn it into a field in a way that has horrible emissions. You can also do it in a way that has barely any. And then if you think about taking some of that wood and maybe turning it into biochar or something like that, you can have even that activity of getting that woodland ready for agriculture be carbon neutral or a carbon sink even through those steps. So like many things in life, there's no simple answer. It's a matter if it's complicated. And if we step back and think about the value in the purpose first rather than just the activity, if the purpose is how do we make utilization of this land better for the planet and better for society, then I think it leads to some good decisions.
That's fantastic. Yeah, we actually are reclaiming an old pasture on our farm using pigs because we are a dairy farm, so it's a nice slow, there's not a big carbon release, we don't go too deep to disturb the soil, and then there is open land that due to a housing development near us probably just needs to be forested, right, because we have a water issue there. So I love the tie-in too. These are not mutually exclusive, and of course in Maine, most of our farmland also contains small woodlots. We are mostly small woodlot owners as farmers in Maine. I saw we had a couple of questions in the back. Yeah? Oh, there we go.
I have a question for John as well on farming issues. My name's Sally Stockwell with, thank you. I'm Sally Stockwell with Maine Audubon, and I'm curious to know if at American Farmland Trust you're thinking, in addition to the questions around carbon sequestration and carbon storage, whether you're thinking about how our farms and farmers can get ready for the changes we're seeing around precipitation, around hotter weather, what kinds of crop changes might we be expecting to see, and how can you build in some more of that resilience, not only for the farming and the produce, but wildlife habitat enhancements.
Yeah, great question. We really, with climate, need to think about both mitigation and adaptation, right? But I never want to put aside the mitigation side because I don't want to give up on that one, and I don't want to go the sort of Florida route of the solution is build the roads higher and stop there, right? We need to go down both paths. The good news is that many of the practices that sequester carbon are the exact same practices that enhance resiliency. In fact, AFT, which has been working on better soil health practices since probably 1982 or 1983, really wasn't thinking about carbon sequestration back then. We began doing that maybe 15 years ago. But if you're building soil health, you have soil that will hold water better in times of drought. You have soil that holds water better in times of heavy precipitation. You have crops that will grow in a healthier soil that will be more resilient. So soil health practices, that's the good news. It's a win-win, right? The same practices have both of these benefits, but that alone is not enough to think about resiliency. We really need agricultural resiliency needs to be community resiliency, right? So that means growing more stuff close to home. That means having local infrastructure that's going to support that activity. And I can go on up and down. The climate changes that we're seeing on farms really are dramatic. And, you know, there's a lot, particularly in sort of eastern liberal areas, there's always a sense, the heartland of America, they don't give a damn about climate change. Maybe some non-farmers in Iowa feel that way. Farmers may be resistant to admitting too much because they're worried what the government might do, but they are witnessing climate change. I have never found a farmer who denies that things are changing. And some of those changes are really tough, and I'm not talking about catastrophic things like floods or fires, but you know, changes in pollinator timing. I'm not being able to get on the field in the spring because it's too wet for your. No, these little things are huge disruptions. And farming already has so many vagaries, so many things associated with just standard weather and markets. To then add this incredible additional variability is really, really scary. So yes, there's a lot of work that we're doing and others are doing, thinking of how you can mitigate that and make both agriculture at the farm scale and at the community scale more resilient. But never forget, we also have to just trap and sequester more carbon too, or we're in serious trouble.
And, all right, hold on. We're going to go here, and then we're going to go right here, because I want to make sure we've got a whole group of young people up front. I want to make sure we inspire them to feel.
And we also
over
have
Zoom,
online.
and over Zoom, I was looking at this to see if there were any. Is it going to come up here for me? Well, we'll see. Okay, right here on the side. Yeah. My name is Josh. Thanks, Josh.
My name is Josh. I'm with the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and I have a quick question for Mike. Maine is the most rural state by proportion of residents in the nation, and we're really under-resourced when it comes to public transit and active transportation resources. And so I wonder what your vision for walkable communities looks like in a state like Maine that's so geographically disparate.
No, that's a great question, and I was also musing on some of the things that John was saying. It's returning to more traditional ways of doing things, which turn out to be much more resilient, right? Rather than what we've done on land use, for example, is, and I was talking about this earlier, you know, we can see in this town, right? It was built around a walkable core, people walking to the mill, right? And even in a town, in a more rural community, the town was built, you know, the houses in the town were built that way. So, you know, to be near each other, we like actually living near each other. And we also like that we had a mix of uses in a place. And, you know, I think that has to be the image we get to. And the farm is also a place, you know, doesn't necessarily have a lot of commuting from a farm. You're on the farm, right? You're making trips to town, and it's self-sufficient, right? You have your own water and wastewater treatment and the like usually, you know? It's that in-between space that's so hard, right? You got to build miles and miles of water pipe and stormwater pipe and asphalt and support it on a tax base that can't support that anymore, doesn't pay for itself. Really recommend an outfit called Strong Towns. If you don't know of it already, go check it out. They just break out the math. So, you know, the urban place, and this is a town, this is an urban place here, and even a small town, you know, has that walkable core. Those places you have the kind of the density of people and uses to support the infrastructure. And again, the farm pays for its own infrastructure for the most part. You had to rural electrification, we need to bring broadband and things like that. You know, you need a public investment, and that's great. It's that in-between space that just doesn't work. And I think that to me is, I think that these are two sides. The land use is and so you notice when we talked about transportation, I went straight to land use, right? Because that's really the key. Now, so we spent 75 years or about in this experiment of building in this way. And it just doesn't work. In addition to all the other things, it chews up farmland, it increases emissions, it raises costs, second highest household cost after housing is transportation. Does not, we now need to start that 75 years worth of investment in the other place and infill housing in communities. I'm staying on the edge of town, so, guilty. It was a less expensive place, right? But I'm at the edge of town, and I was just struck by the fact that right around my hotel are all of these healthcare facilities, and you can't walk to any of them. And walking every day is the best thing you could do for health. And I don't know all the details of what it took to get these mills back in shape, but wouldn't it have been awesome if the healthcare facilities were in the town, within walking distance of where the people were? And I see that all over, and I have some understanding of rural New England. I went to school up in Williamstown, Mass, and I've spent a lot of time in New England. You just see it everywhere. You see the heart of the town has been let go, but on the edge of town are all of these uses. So we've made it so everyone has to drive. And it doesn't have to be that way, even in predominantly rural places. In fact, some of the most delightful places around the country are those main streets that kept their main streets and didn't get washed out. And hell, even Disneyland, which I've never been to, but I've been told, it's like almost the size of Seattle, but you have to park your car on the edge and go everywhere. It's all transit. We spend money. People fly to Europe to spend money to go to these walkable places, right? And then they come back and say, we can't have it here. We could have it here. We did have it here. Just got to go back to it. The town should end, the farm should start. And that's what we need to get back to.
Yeah, and I think we do have some virtual questions as well, and I want to make sure that that we're able to include that. So is Tammy managing the virtual question?
There aren't any questions yet.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, great. Well, fabulous. All right, let's hear from some young people right here.
Good morning. My name is Bryce Hawk, and I teach biology and environmental science at North Yarmouth Academy. And I'm with 11 students who are which is great. They're the leaders of our environmental club at our school, and they've all driven themselves to be here, volunteer to want to come here. And a question really to all three of you, and that is, for folks who have kind of a longer-term perspective on a lot of the issues that you're talking about, is there anything specifically you'd recommend to them as they kind of look, again, to the long view of a lot of the issues that they're talking about that are so important? Thank you.
Oh, can I start? Is that okay? All right, so my daughter's tabling today for Maine Youth Power. She just turned 18. The first thing she did was register to vote. And before she turned 18 and could register to vote, she made sure that she told all of her friends who were already 18 to vote because she couldn't yet. So one of the first things I would recommend that you do is lean on your peers, right? Especially those who are a little bit older than you. Lean on your parents because I can't make dinner in my house without having my children tell me all about the things that they think and feel, which is actually a fantastic time, right? That's our time together. On my long commutes while I drive around rural Maine, I call them after school and they tell me everything that they think and feel on the phone. I am a captive audience. And because I am an adult in this society, I have power in some ways. So talk to your parents about what you care about. If they don't care about the same things you do, make them understand through that personal narrative and storytelling why it's important. Remind them that you will take care of them. This is a very real thing. This is a very real thing. So remind them that you're going to take care of them. And engage the people you can. Learn as much as you can about the things that we, collectively need to feel empowered and passionate about. And then do not forget that as a generation, you are a force, right? Because you are younger, you have more energy than we do, more stamina. You're more diverse. As a generation, there are all kinds of fantastic, very uplifting and encouraging social demographics about where it is that you're starting from. And so we are trying to do a better job at including you. You are sometimes going to have to elbow your way in. And don't be afraid of that. But also don't be afraid to sit and be humble and listen, like to a dairy farmer at a town meeting, to the people who already have that lived experience, right? Because that's a dynamic partnership. So I would start there.
I just go, and I have, 3 kids in their early to mid-20s right now. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons to think that things are bleak, really good reasons. And I just don't want to go doom and gloom here, but if you're feeling like, okay, climate, you know, equity, future democracy in the country, there's a lot of things at stake. I was heartened by 2 things recently in the news. One was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really a climate bill. They just decided to give it another name to make Joe Manchin happy. And you can argue about what you like or don't like about it, but it's probably the most significant piece of climate legislation we've ever seen. And that doesn't happen without the work, in particular, I believe, of Sunrise. And you may remember the moment when the Sunrise folks occupied Nancy Pelosi's office. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez joined them. A lot of tut-tutting in Congress about how a congressperson behaves, whether they were sufficiently respectful. But Joe Manchin didn't pass that bill because he had a change in mind about what he believed in. And he did it because he had to make all of the other senators in his own party happy, right? And they all did it because they were confronted in their elections about what are you going to do about climate. It was made an issue. I think the other one that gave me some hope was the student loan debt relief. Again, same thing. It's like that doesn't happen without a lot of organizing and a public demand. So to me, it was kind of a breakthrough. I don't want to make too much of it. There's so much further to go on so many different things. But the fact that there was movement on 2 issues, which 5 years ago you told me there couldn't be movement on, really, you know, or 2 years ago, you know, in the case of the climate bill, like that seemed dead. It was resurrected. It didn't happen because people in Washington put their brains together and figured it out, although there were some great people there who probably did. It happened because of the public demand that drove it. If you back up a little bit, legalization of marijuana, back up a little bit, gay marriage, those things happen because public demand makes it happen. So our system is not responsive enough, is not doing enough of the right things, but it can be moved. So that would be my message.
Great advice. I don't have a lot to add. I would agree, vote and talk and listen and get yourself educated. But I will add this point. I think we are living in one of the most, perhaps the most important time in history. And that's all of us in this room. But you will live through more of it than I will. And don't be discouraged by what's happening. Instead, reflect on the fact that here's a chance where you can make a huge difference. And you have the luxury of, first off, going to a great school, getting a great education, and living in a state where individuals can make a difference. We're talking at your local town council, we're talking to your state rep, actually has an impact. So be optimistic, but work your butt off.
There you go. And talk to each other. Talk to each other. There are opportunities, right, to talk to one another to sort of grow that power. And we have a question. Let's see.
We have one online, and then I don't know.
Let's take an online question. Let's do an online question. We've got 5 minutes because I want to make sure everyone gets a break.
A question for both. Both resilience and farm preservation require planning to some extent. How do you engage those who might be skeptical of land use planning in that process or those processes?
Ooh, good question. Who wants to start? John? All right. There we go.
There are some people who are just against the notion of land use planning and anyone telling them what to do with their property. So it's a matter of stepping back, as we've talked about earlier, and grounding this not in the specifics of what an ordinance might do or whatever, but what they value. Why do they live in that town? Why do they care about it? In Unity, we enacted amazingly what you could view as progressive ordinances because people ultimately recognized what we were doing was helping the people who had lived there for a long time have the legacy that they cared about. And And there's always that angle. It goes back to everything that Mike was saying about figuring out what those narratives are and how it connects to people in moving there. But then there also is great statistical data too, because and you know, I'm a fan of Myers-Briggs. You can some people need to hear about the big picture. Some people need to hear about the details. You know, different people resonate on different things. And as it comes to farmland protection, you know, what are one of the arguments that you're going to get? Well, we need to build the tax base. That's bogus. Every study that's ever been done, and there's been now hundreds of cost of community service studies, show if you want to keep your taxes low in your community, the absolute best thing you can do is keep farms there. Why? Because cows don't go to school, right? And residential development invariably costs more in services. And I can go on down the list. This is not the time. But there is both an emotional connection and there is an analytical reason why this is good stuff.
You know, just another observation. If the thought is that we either do or don't need planning, everything you're looking at was planned. Those highways, somebody planned them, right? That suburbia was a housing program. We don't think of it that way, but it was, right? We had federal policies that both built the highways, that funded the roadways, and subsidized the mortgages, and eliminated the federal programs eliminated lending for your classic downtown mixed-use building of retail on the ground floor and offices of residential above it. You couldn't borrow for that anymore. Everything you see turned out was the result of somebody's plan. They were just bad plans, okay? So really what we need to do is have a little bit more humility about our ability from the top down to plan. I would suggest that. I think that places are ecosystems too, which grow organically. And if you look at the history of towns and cities, you know, some of the most beautiful places in the world, places that, again, we travel to visit, you know, there wasn't something, nobody got a master's in urban planning to build that wonderful, charming streetscape and those buildings right next to each other and the local shops and retail and restaurants. Right? It happened, it just came from human being. I think we need to have a little more trust in humans to build great towns, and I think we need to stop the plans to keep expanding the highways and the sprawl that's destroying our community. So yeah, it was planned, it just wasn't really well planned, and we need to have a little more humility about the ability of human beings to build delightful places if we give them a little more freedom to do so in the places where they should build. And we let other places be the way they should be as well.
And that is time, but I feel like that's the most perfect segue in the entire world. I want to say that that's why GrowSmart plays such an absolute critical role in convening and managing this, because when things are unplanned or when they're particularly bad plans, we know that there are certain communities who are the most vulnerable to the effects of bad planning, and that's urban and rural spaces. There are certain communities that we are, you know, dedicated to trying to not harm any longer and hopefully probably lift up, and that's why GrowSmart is such an incredible partner, because that thoughtful planning is really what needs to happen. So I'm going to welcome Nancy, the executive director. Or no, we're just going to be done now. Okay, we're just done now. John, Mike, thank you so much for making the trip. Thank you.
I see the questions that weren't answered. Please come to the reception. That's the whole point, is to have this time. We're calling it the return of the reception, because we're gathered here today and people are comfortable enough we can gather together and be social later. I have a couple of assignments for you as we go to break. One is, again, to thank Mike and John. I hadn't met Mike before, but America Walks is hosting the a walking college here in Maine. Kirsten Brewer, who serves on my board, is one of their mentors. It was extraordinary to hear from him. I have known John Piotti for 20 years. I served with him those same years in the legislature. Now, you all know why I love him so much, the extraordinary wisdom with the passion that he is willing to share with all of us. As you're going to break, and before we go to the breakout rooms, about Policy Action 2023, thank you for advancing the slide for me. We have tables over here with printed posters. For those of you who like to weigh in on things quietly rather than speaking, we've got dots and sticky notes, and some of us love dots and sticky notes. I do. Put a green dot by an idea that you like. Put a red dot by an idea maybe you're not so thrilled about. If you want to write on the poster, if you want to write on a sticky note, add your comments to it. And before I transition us with our assignment, this conversation was extraordinary because we were talking about advocacy. We were talking about things that you all are doing now. I had heat pumps installed in my house on Monday. I posted on Facebook. I linked to Efficiency Maine because of their rebate. That's advocacy. And if you have solar panels, if you bike to work, when you are talking to people about what you do, you're doing advocacy. What I'm hoping today is that you will feel more comfortable doing it to the deciders. At whatever age you are, you're doing it now, you're having the conversations, we can step into it more. Policy Action 2023 is a way for you to do this. It is a crowdsourcing approach to advocacy. We are creating legislative proposals in a transparent and collaborative way. It's giving up the illusion of control. I love to pretend I'm in charge. I've learned over life many times over, it is an illusion. So letting go of the illusion of control. It's showing your work before it's done, which means other people might notice mistakes. And it's allowing and inviting other people to feel a sense of ownership in what you're doing. This is all uncomfortable for many of us. I had to get used to it. It's never been done like this before. This cross-sector conversations, statewide conversations, we're building this thing together, and today we're inviting you to be a part of it. So as you go to break, there are 4 breakout rooms. This has been on the website. You've got a link to it. It's in the program. There are 8 policy action areas. Kara Wilbur, my partner in crime on this, and I took the 8 broad policy actions, put them into 4 groups. Think about the one space where you really want to be actively engaged. We have a facilitator, a note taker, and a Zoom connector for those of you who are out on Zoom to have conversations around the questions that we outline on the posters, and you'll see it in the breakout rooms. Is the language clear? Do you have any questions? Do the proposals actually address the policy action that we were supposed to be addressing? Are there intersections that are worth noting as we move forward? We paired these very deliberately where we saw commonalities. What do you like about the points being made? Where would you offer guidance or offer concerns? And what's missing? As you go to break for about 10 minutes, which I know isn't nearly long enough, but it gives us a full 45 minutes for these conversations. As you're looking at these, we need to decide who's going to go where based on size of the audience for each. Can you give me a sense? I'm going to ask you for rooms 1 through 4. What is your sense that you want to go to breakout room number 1? Okay. Breakout room number 2. Strong. Breakout room number 3. Great, and breakout room number 4. Thank you. Please go on break. Restrooms are back past the refreshments in the corner. There's also one straight back in here. Refresh yourself any way that you need to, and we will be back. I'm trying to look at what the time frame is. At 11:15. So we will by then be able to direct you to what breakout rooms to go to. Thank you. We'll see you soon. All right, as we are shifting gears to come back into the breakout rooms, let me give you the lineup, and you'll see some placards. If you are interested in room number 1 and breakout room number 4, they will be out in the lobby. Breakout rooms 1 and 4 are out in the lobby. If you're interested in breakout room number 2, it's going to be here in the main room. If you like breakout room number 3, it's going to be in what we call the living room through that door. Ian, can you back it up? Oh, wait, I can, I think. There we go. All right. Breakout rooms number 1 and 4 are out in the lobby. Breakout room 2, stay here. Breakout room 3, go through these doors, and there's a living area. And is Robert O'Brien within the sound of my voice? I need to talk to you. Okay, good. Maybe he's already on it. Okay. Breakout room number 2 is in this room. Breakout room number 3 is through these doors. Breakout rooms 1 and 4 are out in the lobby. There are posters to show you that. And we'll do it.
shift your seats so you're not stuck in the, I think, I don't know.
Salt water is the one part?
Salt water, you said?
Yeah, salt water.
What did I do? I was gonna want to grab my phone for timing. Okay, so I think we're supposed to get started, and I know they said that they have someone over there who's also monitoring Zoom, I think. Are you still making your way on?
Yeah, wireless access.
Okay. Do we have, and sorry, I'm Zoe, which I don't know your name. Ian, do we, is there somebody who's looking at Zoom to see if we have questions? Yeah, they said that, yeah, I know, but they said they had it too, so I don't know. Tammy will, okay, great, okay. Well, welcome, folks. So we are Breakout 2. Hi, Ethan. So we are focused on transportation, and there's 2 policy actions around transportation. I think I'd love to have us just quickly kind of bring everybody into the room and go around and just say who you are and how, like, what connects you to this conversation today, whether that's your community or volunteer role you play or your job. And then we'll jump in. And I think the goal is to have a conversation and get your input on the work that work groups have done thus far. And we're not making decisions today. We're more in a space of getting folks to react and weigh in on the work that's been done thus far. And I can, after we do intros, I can just give a little bit of info about the process in case folks are not aware about that. But so I'm Zoe Miller, and I'm wearing my Moving Maine Network hat. We're a statewide coalition focused on transportation equity, so better access for folks who have the most barriers. And I'll pass it over to Josh.
Great. I'm Josh with the Natural Resources Council of Maine. I'm the appointed bus driver of Policy Action Group number 2, which has had some issues so far.
I think that's on. We might want to do that.
Okay.
So because I heard that if you're online, you can't hear it all unless somebody uses the microphone.
I'm Miles Smith. I'm the executive director of the Maine Broadband Coalition, but I'm here more in a volunteer capacity. I live in Portland.
Tom Poirier, Director of Community Development for the town of Gorham. I mean, we're dealing with transportation issues every day, complete streets, all that, and just how do we move the region forward? I guess both with transportation and the other thing I'm more inclined to learn about GrowSmart is we don't really talk about it that much. Kind of like the third rail is really the funding mechanism for transportation is broken. And then so how do we fix that? Because without organizations pushing politicians to talk about how to fund roads or transportation or bike lanes, it's never going to get fixed. So I think that needs to be a topic for here as well.
Mm-hmm.
Matt Drost, Regional Planner, Maine DOT.
Hi, Patrick Conlon, Eastern Trail Alliance, and Bike BS, which stands for Bike Biddeford Saco, small, independent, grassroots bicycle advocacy organization.
Hi, my name's Tom Martin. I'm currently a legislator, and I sit on the Transportation Committee, so I have a big target right here. And I also work for Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness as the Director of Innovation and Sport.
Hi, everyone. Passamaquoddy citizen, Lisa Saca Basin. I help to lead Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness, an Indigenous organization here in Maine.
Hi, my name is Bryce Hawk, and I'm a former board member with GrowSmart Maine, and now teaching AP Environmental Science and Biology at North Yarmouth Academy.
Hi, Ethan Boxer Mackenber. I'm a board member at GrowSmart Maine, and by day I develop low and middle income housing.
And I think we'll,
Always infill.
we
and
missed
always,
George, so.
Always smart.
Hi, George O'Keefe, Economic Development Director, Town of Rumford.
So, oh, and actually, sorry, I'll fake you out there.
Hi, I'm Jim Tassi. I'm the Assistant Director of the Bicycle Coalition of Maine.
Hi, I'm Joe Easton. I'm Audience Director at the Bangor Daily News, where I'm working on building a plan to grow reporting and fill in news deserts around the state.
Hi, I'm Jeff Levine. I'm a board member at GrowSmart Maine, and I'm also on the Greater Portland Metro Board. And my day job, I teach at MIT in the Urban Studies and Planning program and consult with communities in Maine and around New England.
Hi, Art Stevens. I'm a business development officer with Coastal Enterprises. We're a statewide community development financial institution. I work developing loans that we can transact, but also as an intermediary between the companies that we finance and people looking for work. And transportation oftentimes is that missing link. So that's why I'm here to listen today. Thanks.
I'm Emma, and I'm a student at North Yarmouth Academy.
I'm Greta, and I'm also a student at North Yarmouth Academy.
I'm Byron Bartlett. I'm the Director of Director of Administration for Portland Downtown, and I bike to work every day, basically April through November, so bike lanes are important to me.
Hi, I'm Mackenzie Delisle. I work with Byron over at Portland Downtown. I do marketing and events there, but our organization as a whole is just really interested in making sure Portland is a walkable city. And I walk to work 24/7, 365 days a year. So yeah, I'm also very passionate about this as well.
Don't go to work on Sundays.
I'm Sam Pikus. I'm a planner with North Star Planning, and I'm an avid cyclist, and I like to ride my bike to work from Portland to New Gloucester.
Cool. And then Liz, did you want to introduce?
Hi, I'm Liz Trice. I'm unsuccessfully trying to coordinate between Bangor and all Zoom participants in this room at the same time. But I'm on the Complete Streets Working Group and working on building middle-income housing in Portland and elsewhere, and involved in transportation advocacy in the Portland area.
And do we have folks on, I don't know that we'll go all through, but do we have folks on joining us by Zoom? Or maybe I'll come back to that. Okay, so first off, I wanted to just say a few words about this process, so the Policy Action 2023 process. I think it's, in a way, building coalitions while it's also crowdsourcing policy solutions. So it was spearheaded by GrowSmart Maine and Build Maine, so two organizations that are thinking a lot about place and how we develop and retrofit in ways that create, all the things that we heard about from John and Mike and Rhiannon this morning, places that are, healthy and pleasant to be in, and people can be active, and the economy is thriving. And so we have a process going on right now with work groups that are meeting around 8 topic areas and looking to come to agreement on what are the actions we want to take on each of those topics. In some cases, it will be legislation, so we will be advancing some kind of legislative action, but it won't necessarily be legislative. Sometimes it's building relationships, advocating short of that process. I'll say I personally came on board because I facilitate a statewide coalition that's focused on transportation access for the folks who have the most barriers, so thinking about older adults, people with low incomes, people of color, people with disabilities. It's kind of a long list of people who have barriers to transportation, frankly. And so the Moving Maine Network has been doing this work, and we also prioritize both of these issues. So rather than be off on the side doing our work, I came to this table. Josh has just come on to be the chair of Policy Action 2, and it's kind of a great example of how equity and social justice often makes a very good partner with environmental concerns and economic concerns. I mean, I think with transportation, it's everything, right? It's how do we get to the opportunities that we need. So what we wanted to do today is share the work so far, and we may, because I don't know about you, but I can barely read this from here, invite people to get up and walk around and look at these. We can separate them so there's more breathing room between them, and have a conversation. Josh will be capturing notes. I think we'd like to know, what do you think? What do you think is missing? What do you like? Are we being bold enough? Are we being too bold? You know, I think we've had very good conversations in the Complete Streets group with very active participation from our partners from Maine Department of Transportation. And I think the process of those conversations is a product on its own that, you know, I came into this, I didn't know Matt Dross from DOT. We now are, you know, having conversations weekly. And I think our hope, or I'll say some of us at least, and I'm one of them, our hope is to provide more of, there was that kind of the three pieces that Mike from America Walks talked about earlier, that you need 2 out of 3. So you have elected leaders, folks who work for public agencies, and the public. And from my view, we haven't had a strong enough voice from the public on what people really want. We've had pieces of it, and it feels like we're in this place where it's coming together. And it's coming together at a time where we have a lot of encouragement from the federal government, from Federal Highway Administration, from Federal Transit Administration, so from USDOT overall, to do better in terms of equity and to do better in terms of safety for people who are not inside vehicles. And so we are taking a shot at how we can operationalize some of that here in Maine, how we can make that happen. So I guess I would say the one other thing I want to say is we are trying to wrap, you know, we have an election coming up. I don't know if you knew that. And so after the election, we'll have the deadline for when bill titles need to be submitted. So that's happening sometime before the end of the year, and that's a deadline for us in this work. If we want to take legislative action, we need to hit that deadline. We aren't there yet. We need you to tell us what's missing, what you want to see, what you like. So with that, I would say, I guess maybe a show of hands, like how many people feel like they've already read this and they're ready to talk? A few? Okay, so I'm gonna say let's get up, and I think, did people also receive this electronically, or is this, yeah, okay. So if you wanna pull out your phone or your laptop and do it that way, or if you wanna get up and look at them, let's take a few minutes to look at them and start chatting with each other, and then we will have a one person at a time conversation so Josh can get the notes. So I'm gonna set a timer for about 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll have a full group conversation. So feel free to, oh, that's a really smart idea. I'm gonna put this one over here so there's just a little space between the two. And I lost my tape. I think we're using stickies as, we're using these. Can you actually peel one off for me? There we go. All right. Okay, now I need to actually set my timer. And I need water. Be right back. It got really warm. I'm just grabbing water. I'm not running away. I'm just grabbing water. I'm just grabbing water. I'm not running away from my job.
so I'm just closing my laptop.
Okay. Are they sending a message to the Zoom people?
Well, it seems that this room is being covered by the central.
Oh, okay.
And then out there, and then it's, I was written one from like June 2 on the schedule within 10, so it's supposed to be one of these so I
That's okay. So I just gave people 5 minutes to digest this.
What organization are you with?
Yeah. Oh, so we're not, I mean, you don't have to do stickers right now. I actually don't know what.
Okay. I just took one, so. Yeah. Okay, sounds good.
So we have about 2 minutes.
Some of these are actually goals, and some of them are strategies. You know what I mean? Like you might have to build the team to accomplish blah, blah,
I
blah.
know.
You might
Well,
have
I
to-
wasn't involved with this, and I think this needs
You
some.
need to do the same thing with the goals.
Yeah.
It's like, what's the big goal? What's the how?
Yes. There's a lot. There's a lot there. So let's come back together and let's come back together and I'm going to actually, Liz, if you, do you mind running that around, playing Phil Donahue? So we have about 10 minutes, I guess, 10 or 15, depending which clock you're looking at. So we'd love to just have people jump in and share their thoughts. And, sorry, that's the timer. So don't be shy. Who wants to share what they're thinking? Miles, do you want to, Liz? Oh, sorry.
This is my job.
I liked both. I liked a lot of what we had to say on both of these. On the reworking transportation, I was curious about the word provide appropriate public transit to all communities, and I wonder, like, what does that mean? I read it as, like, every town, or is appropriate public transportation for every town mean that some towns won't get any? Just trying to be realistic about what's achievable and what's efficient. So that was one thought here. And on the other side, I thought number 3 was great. And I wondered if we could On the issue of Stroads, I thought that was excellent and one of our biggest problems in the state, and I wonder if we could even think about either closing streets to cars in some circumstances, in some places, or replacing car-focused streets with pedestrian and bike-focused streets entirely, like making them like what you see in Barcelona, where you have pavers and cars are only allowed at certain times of the day, or they're open for deliveries, but then otherwise are pedestrianized in the afternoons, that kind of thing. So those are my 2 thoughts.
Great. Who wants to?
Thanks. So one thought that strikes me about the planning, I think, is the message and how that gets delivered. And one of the things that hasn't been talked about here right now is the level and the depth of the inequity and the orders of magnitude involved. And this is one of the reasons why I participate in this group. And as some of the people who encouraged me to do so will tell you, I really didn't have any desire to go through another 2-year legislative process to build something and then just kind of maybe have to work through a process that was going to be really, really difficult and long. The depth of the inequity that exists in transit funding right now is something we are skipping over because we're moving to solutions. And in doing so, in my opinion, that's the kind of thing that usually happens when we have a complicated and difficult discussion that potentially really involves the reallocation of resources at some point. And I think that's what has to happen. And I think it has to happen because my community does not have any intercity transit service at all. None. We have a connector bus that goes to Lewiston every now and then, but we do not have any intercity transit. And as I was just telling Mr. Martin over here, there are places in the state of Maine right now that have intercity transit service several times an hour. So before we talk about nice things like bicycle lanes and complete streets and sidewalks, which we love very much and are very important to us, I don't like the way that the resources have been allocated to some of the wealthier communities in our state. And we're not talking about that because I think it's uncomfortable. And I think we have to acknowledge it. The inequities on this specific issue of state funding are really profound. They're not like a little bit off. They are way off. Orders of magnitude, entire zeros in the accounting lines off. And they're not being spoken of, and my community got left behind. We got left behind. And we're being left behind every single year in every single legislative package that funds transportation in the state of Maine right now. That's got to stop.
Thank you, George.
So complete streets, I mean, I think most towns that have urban centers are on board with it. When I look at complete streets, and I'm not sure how many people know about it, but so if you're an urbanized area, you get put into the MS4 communities, and the stormwater is a big regulating stormwater. So we are getting pushed back hard regarding less impervious area and removing sidewalks and shortening roads and decreasing widths and all that. So we get this give and take where we want to do bike lanes, we want to do sidewalks, we want to do stuff to support the people, but we're getting pushed back from DEP, EPA about less impervious. So how do we do both? I think that's where it's going to be the struggle for urbanized area, because it's just going to promote sprawl. And I told DEP and EPA that by you guys not allowing us to build spaces with walkways and bike lanes that can support people, you're just going to push people to the outsides. So that's a whole different conversation that's happening that's not being synced together. So communities are getting pushed in two different things. The other things, I mean, I've talked to transportation funding a little bit. I mean, if you hear Bruce Van Note talk, I think their level of service that they're trying to shoot for collecting arterial roads is C. So they don't even have enough funding to get the roads to a level of service that would be a B or an A. So to me, again, the funding mechanism is broken. If we can't even, we're barely keeping the roads going the way they are to serve cars and transit. We're going to take more funding from them. I mean, it just needs to be a rework of that funding cycle, to me.
I see Jeff had his hand up.
give the mic to whoever's the loudest.
That wasn't my music, so. But thanks for getting the attention to me. So two things. I really like the framework here. One thing I think is a very specific action that the state could take would be to increase per capita funding for public transit. It's one of the lowest in the country. It's 1/10 of what Vermont, another rural state, spends. And I was a little disappointed with this past legislative session that there wasn't a lot of action on it. There was a lot of talk about it. But we need to fund public transit everywhere, in every community, like was said, in a way that at least our peer states are doing, if not better, if we really want to get to some of the goals of Maine Won't Wait. And in terms of level of service, I actually think that for urban areas, level of service D is maybe as high as we want to try to go, because we're just going to be chasing our own tail otherwise. I think urban areas are going to be congested, and we can't build our way out of that. We need to provide alternatives for those who want to and accept that urban areas are congested. And I know that's tough in Maine, where we're used to not having to deal with traffic, but we just can't pour all our money into building more roads.
Who else has thoughts? I'm curious. We'd love to hear from some of our younger folks at the table, and no pressure if you want to think about it while he's...
My name is Byron. I have a general question about policy action number 2, and please don't throw things at me. This is to build my knowledge. It feels to me when I read through that it's very it's agnostic to gas-powered vehicles, but I feel like that's in there. And so other modes of transportation, obviously, it's in the title, multimodal, but are trains being looked at? Are cable cars being looked at? I mean, there are certain things that I think we've become such a gas-powered society that the way we look at transportation is through that lens. And I fear that the funding, if you use the idiom like from the movie Field of Dreams, if you build it, they'll come. Does that policy action item encourage urban sprawl or encourage sprawl? That's just a question. If you build it, are you sending people further out into rural Maine?
I'm not going to attempt to answer that. I actually have not been at these work group meetings. I don't know if there's someone who has that wants to speak to that. I mean, again, I think we're still in process, so if you have feelings about it, we want you to show up, and we can hook you up with when the meetings are. I don't know, Josh, do you want to say anything about what's on there right now?
I think mostly we just need to have a conversation with the whole group and make sure they've been able to accomplish that with policy group number 2. So we need to reinvigorate, getting together and having this conversation to start. And we can dive into some of these, but I think this session here is more to ask those questions so that we can take them down and address them in future meetings. But it's a good question.
Yeah, I would say that group has, in terms of where groups are in their process, that one is much earlier in the conversation. So great opportunity to shape what comes out. And I think the comments, all the comments that have been shared are really helpful. Do you have anything you want to say? Well, we'll come back to you if you, did you want to, I think Miles wanted to.
I'm just curious, George, to maybe link these things together. You're talking about transportation spending being inequitable, right? That the money is being spent too much in southern coastal Maine and not reaching Rumford and other places. Is that right? And that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, so, as one example, how many times a day is there intercity transit between Brunswick and Portland, right? So probably like 2 or 3, 4 times an hour, Concord Coach, Breeze Bus, Downeaster, which is all really good stuff. And the Downeaster is really, really important to the economic development of high-density urban areas. But by the same token, southern coastal areas of Maine have seen a lot of investment. Places like Farmington, Skowhegan, Rumford don't get the same bite at the apple even though we have similar redevelopment needs. Why did the Downeaster go to Brunswick? Because they lost the Navy base. That was the primary driver in the economic justification for putting rail passenger service into Brunswick. It was going to help revitalize them when the Navy base closed. We've been trying to revitalize for 35 years and never received that same level of attention or funding. So when I look at what's happening, I see a very successful effort to concentrate resources. And I think the prosperity of southern and coastal Maine is because southern and coastal Maine has successfully concentrated resources and successfully done case making that has enabled them to get more funding than places that are not necessarily as good at advocacy as others. That's why. That's the fundamental truth of how inequities occur. Somebody can make a better case than somebody else.
I'm just observing that this number 2 is all about how we get the money and not necessarily how it's allocated. And is that the root of what you're getting at, that needs to be?
Yeah, so actually, it's really important that we're talking about money here, which is really important. But what we're not talking about, and what I think the legislators are going to need to hear, is why we're talking about the money. Mm-hmm. Because I'm worried that we're just going to show up and say it's inequitable. That's a word that gets used a lot. We talk a lot about trying to deal with the inequities of the economy or the communities or the world that we live in. But we have to acknowledge that this particular set of inequities is exceptionally profound. That's why I'm here. I'm not here because this is a small problem. I'm here because this is a massive problem for my community. A really, really big one. And they haven't had the time or the ability to tackle it. So I'm saying as a preface, when we go to the legislature, because I believe this group will, I believe we will make a proposal for change, we have to be able to case make to them that the inequities of our current transportation funding scheme are deep, very, very deep, much deeper than inequities that occur in other areas of policy in state government funding.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering, who's the note taker for this group?
Josh
Okay,
is.
Great, that's awesome. So not as the important microphone holder, but just as a participant, I love the talk about inequities. I mean, I usually think about it as like, oh, we just spent another, $200 million on something for drivers of cars and like, $5 on everything else for people who can't or don't drive. But I love the idea of bringing in the regional thing and also bringing up the comparative. Like, I didn't know that Vermont spends 10 times as much on transit as us. And also creating, in terms of inequities, making it legal for less expensive, less pollutive types of transportation to be usable. So, thinking about a future where we're using a lot of electric bikes and neighborhood electric vehicles. China's coming out with these little enclosed cars that they go 25, 30 miles an hour that you can buy for $4,000. That could be our future, but that's not legal right now. So how can we move towards more modes that are inexpensive as opposed to, I don't know what it costs per transit rider with Metro. But my guess is it would be a hell of a lot cheaper to make electric vehicles legal and let people buy their own inexpensive vehicles rather than trying to figure out how to bus everybody all over the state of Maine, which we also need to do, but it's that's really, really expensive. So I always look for what's the policy change we can make that essentially is free and allows people to just do something that's less expensive rather than having to subsidize something that's very expensive.
Okay.
Other
people. We're moving those groups first, then you.
Okay.
They can come back.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I would love to make space for folks who haven't had a chance to talk yet. And sorry. Is there anybody who hasn't made a comment and wanted to, before we go to, okay, all right, go ahead, Tom.
So, we're talking about multimodal transportation across Maine, which, you talk about northern Maine, and really you need to get to a density that's going to support it, right? If we start throwing multimodal and buses or transportation all across the state, people are just going to see that we're funding buses that aren't full, and you have that conversation, that narrative that gets driven. So I'm just curious, when you guys have this discussion about multimodal transportation across the state, I know that the town that I'm in, we currently work with USM and Metro to have bus service, and we pay for that service. has there been discussions or do we look at transit-oriented development in certain areas? Is that what you guys are looking at, that kind of across Maine, or is it kind of wide open?
Well, I have something I want to say, and then Josh. So I think that this question of what's appropriate, I mean, I think we have folks who are living in places, I think of conversations I've been part of with folks in Washington County. People need some kind of transportation. Maybe it's not a giant bus, maybe it's volunteer driver programs, maybe it's a more robust kind of, flex route. They need it. And to George's point, it's an equity issue. So I think what we're trying to focus on is figuring out what's appropriate. It's kind of similar to complete streets. We're not saying that the streets need to look the same in every single community. The transportation won't look the same in every single community. And I would just say, like in southern Maine, where we are a very, relatively speaking, transit-rich area, we have huge inequities in terms of people who have zero income to pay, places where you really need to spend your whole day to get, even though we have transit, so it's better, but it's not good enough. And so I would just, like, my perspective is rather than us fighting for the crumbs, to really say, like, what is the transportation future that we want, and acknowledge that it will be different in different parts of the state.
Thanks. I didn't mean to say that we shouldn't be having transit all over Maine, to George's point. But like what I was thinking about, it blew my mind when I was in Columbia a couple years ago, that literally every little town, like residents 200, has transit that goes to it.
Right.
And it's not, I don't think it's publicly funded. Like I've been in a lot of Central American countries where it's essentially there's a town square, and basically anybody can have a minivan running from that town square to like a route, and sometimes there's 5 minivans in a row and sometimes there's 2, but it's just like a much lighter system that's not as, I don't know, it's much more homespun. And so I'm wondering if there might be something in between Airbnb and just knowing someone and having an entire bus. Like maybe we can create lighter systems of shared rides. Or routes that anybody who has free time can drive.
Josh, did you want to say something before we lose folks here? I think what's happening is we're going to be invited next to grab lunch, so we just have a couple more minutes before the lunch line is ours.
Yeah, I think this is all really good stuff to chew on going forward. I think it is about building those nodes where it's like you can access a certain place via public transit, and then from there, the individual localities can do the last mile transit from there to residences. But it's like identifying, even in a rural state like Maine, that public transit still is a viable opportunity. 72% of seniors that are aged out of vehicles don't have access to a fixed or flex transit route, and so they're virtually homebound unless they have family members that can take them from place to place. So it's, finding those nodes throughout the state where people are able to access them with relative proximity, and then, public transit is a low-cost way relative to building out highways. And I think that's a focus for the funding program, which is that the Maine Department of Transportation spends 74% of all of its capital on highway and bridge funding every single year, and the reallocation of that funding to a broader range of multimodal transit is what we're looking for. So don't want to hold people back from lunch, but thank you all for your comments.
Thank you. And I think I would just end it by saying I think we're talking about finding the solutions that are right for different communities, which might include shared, neighborhood cars or e-bikes. It's making space for the conversation to touch every community. I think that, for me, that's what that appropriate piece is. So we would love to have folks join that conversation. The Policy Action 3, love to have you join the conversation, and we appreciate you taking time to join us today. So thank you all.